Chapter 39 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 39. Skirmishing. To the great chagrin of his mother, and, indeed, of everybody, Pitt took his departure a few days before the necessary set termination of his visit. He must, he declared, have a few days to run down from London into the country and find out the Gainsborough family. If Colonel Gainsborough and his daughter had really gone home, he must know. "What on earth do you want to know for?" his father had angrily asked. "What concern is it to you, in any way?" "Pitt, I wish you would take all the time you have and use it to make yourself agreeable to Miss Frere. Where could you do better?" "I have no time for that now, sir." "Time? What is time? Don't you admire her?" "Everyone must do that." "I have an idea she don't dislike you. It would suit your mother and me very well. She has not money, but she has everything else. There has been no girl more admired in Washington these 2 winters past. No girl. You would have a prize, I can tell you, that many a one would like to hinder your getting." "I have no time, sir, now, and I must find out my old friends, first of all." "Do you mean you want to marry that girl?" said Mr. Dallas, imprudently flaming out. Pitt was at the moment engaged in mending up a precious old volume, which by reason of age and use had become dangerously dilapidated. He was manipulating skillfully, as one accustomed to the business, with awl and a large needle, surrounded by his glue pot and bits of leather and paper. At the question, he lifted up his head and looked at his father. Mr. Dallas did not like the look. It was too keen and had too much recognition in it. He feared he had unwarily showed his play. But Pitt answered, then quietly, going on with his work again, "I said nothing of that, sir. I do not know anything about that. My old friends may be in distress. Both are one of them. It is not at all unlikely, I think. If things had gone well with them, you would have been almost sure to hear of their whereabouts at least. I made a promise, at any rate, and I am bound to find them, one side or the other of the Atlantic." "Don Quixote," muttered his father. "Colonel Gainsborough, I have no doubt, has gone home to his people, whom he ought never to have left. In that case, I can certainly find them." Mr. Dallas seldom made the mistake of spoiling his cause with words. He let the matter drop, though his mouth was full of things he would have liked to speak. So the time came for Pitt's departure, and he went. And the 2 women he left behind him hardly dared to look at each other, the one lest she should betray her sorrow, and the other lest she should seem to see it. Betty honestly suffered. She had found Pitt's society delightful. It had all the urbanity without the emptiness of that she was accustomed to. Whether right or wrong, he was undoubtedly a person in earnest, who meant his life to be something more than a dream or a play, and who had higher ends in view than to understand dining, or even to be an acknowledged critic of light literature, or a leader of fashion. Higher ends even than to be at the head of the state or a leader of its armies. There was enough natural nobleness in Betty to understand Pitt, at least in a degree, and to be mightily attracted to all this. And his temper was so fine, his manners so pleasant, his tender deference to his mother so beautiful. Ah, such a man's wife would be well sheltered from some of the harshest winds that blow in the face of human nature. Even if he were a little fanatical, it was a fanaticism which Betty half hoped, half inconsistently feared, would fade away with time. He had stayed just long enough to kindle a fire in her heart, which now she could not with a blow or a breath extinguish. Not long enough for the fire to catch any loose tinder lying about on the outskirts of his. Pitt rode away heart whole, she was obliged to confess to herself, so far, at least, as she was concerned, and Betty had nothing to do now but to feel how that fire bit her, and to stifle the smoke of it. Mrs. Dallas was a woman and a mother, and she saw what they would not have had her see for any money. "I think Pitt was taken with her," she said to her husband, as one seeks to strengthen a faint belief by putting it into words. He is taken with nothing but his own obstinacy, growled Mr. Dallas. His obstinacy never troubled you, said the mother. It was always like that, but never for anything bad. It's for something foolish then, and that will do as well. Did you sound him? Yes. And what did he say? Said he must see Esther Gainsborough first, confound him. Esther Gainsborough? But he tried and could not find them. He will try on the other side now. He'll waste his time running all over England to discover the family place, and then he will know that there is more looking to be done in America. And he talked of coming over next year. Husband, he must not come. We must go over there. Next summer. Yes, that is the only thing to do. And we will take Betty Frere along with us. Mrs. Dallas said nothing of this scheme at present to the young lady, though it comforted herself. Perhaps it would have comforted Betty, too, whose hopes rested on the very faint possibility of another summer's gathering at Seaforth. That was a very doubtful possibility. The hope built upon it was vaporously unsubstantial. She debated with herself whether the best thing were not to take the first passable offer that should present itself, marry and settle down, and so deprive herself of the power of thinking about Pitt, and him of the fancy that she ever had thought about him. Poor girl, she had verified the truth of the word which speaks about going on hot coals. She had burned her feet. She had never done it before. She had played with a dozen men at different times, allowed them to come near enough to be looked at, dallied with them, discussed and rejected, successfully, without her own heart ever even coming in danger. As to danger to theirs, that indeed had not been taken into consideration, or had not excited any scruple. Now, the fire bit her, and she could not stifle it, and a grave doubt came over her whether even that expedient of marriage might be found able to stifle it. She went away from Seaforth a few days after Pitt's departure, a sadder woman than she had come to it, though, I fear, scarce a wiser. On her way to Washington she tarried a few days in New York, and there it chanced that she had a meeting which, in the young lady's then state of mind, had a tremendous interest for her. Society in New York at that day was very little like society there now. Even granting that the same principles of human nature underlay its developments, the developments were different. Small companies, even of fashionable people, could come together for an evening. Dancing, although loved and practiced, did not quite exclude conversation. Supper was a far less magnificent affair, and fashion itself was much more necessarily and universally dependent on the accessories of birth, breeding, and education than is the case at present. It was known who everybody was. Parvenus were few, and there was still a flavor left of old-world traditions and colonial antecedents. So, when Miss Frere was invited to one of the best houses in the city to spend the evening, she was not surprised to find only a moderate little company assembled, and dresses and appointments on an easy and unostentatious footing, which now was nearly unheard of. There was elegance enough, however, both in the dresses and persons of many of those present, and Betty was quite in her element, finding herself as usual surrounded by attentive and admiring eyes, and able to indulge her love of conversation, for this young lady liked talking better than dancing. Indeed, there was no dancing in the early part of the evening. It was rather a musical company, and Betty's favorite amusement was often interrupted, for the music was too good, and the people present too well bred, to allow of that jumble of sounds, musical and unmusical, which is so distressing, and alas, not so rare. Several bits of fine, old-fashioned music had been given, from Mozart and Beethoven and Handel, and Betty had got into full swing of conversation again, when a pause around her gave notice that another performer was taking her seat at the piano. Betty checked her speech with a little impulse of vexation, and cast her eyes across the room. "Who is it now?" she asked. There was a little murmur of question and answer, for the gentleman immediately at hand did not know. Then she was told, "It is a Miss Gainsborough." "Gainsborough?" Betty's eyes grew large, and her face took a sudden gravity. "What Gainsborough?" Nobody knew. "English, I believe," somebody said. All desire to talk died out of Betty's lips. She became as silent as the most rigid decorum could have demanded. and applied herself to listen, and of course those around her were becomingly silent also. What was the astonishment of them all, to hear the notes of a hymn, and then the hymn itself, sung by a sweet voice with very clear accent, so that every word was audible! The hymn was not known to Miss Frere. It was fine and striking, and the melody, also unfamiliar, was exceedingly simple. Everybody listened. That was manifest. It was more than the silence of politeness which reigned in the rooms until the last note was ended, and Betty listened more eagerly than anybody, and a strange thrill ran through her. The voice which sang the hymn was not finer, not so fine as many as one she had heard. It was thoroughly sweet and had a very full and rich tone. Its power was only moderate. The peculiarity lay in the manner with which the meaning was breathed into the notes. Betty could not get rid of the fancy that it was a spirit singing, and not a woman. Simpler musical utterance she had never heard, nor any, in her life, that so went to the heart. She listened and wondered as she listened what it was that so moved her. The voice was tender, pleading, joyous, triumphant. How anybody should dare sing such words in a mixed company, Betty could not conceive. Yet she envied the singer, and heard with a strange twinge at her heart the words of the chorus, which was given with the most penetrating ring of truth. Glory, 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 glory be to God on high. Glory, 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 sing his praises through the sky. Glory, 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 glory to the Father give. Glory, 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 sing his praises, all that live. The hymn went on to offer Christ's salvation to all who would have it, and closed with a variation of the chorus, taken from the song of the redeemed in heaven. Worthy is the Lamb that was slain. As sweet and free as the jubilant shout of a bird, the notes rang, with a lift in them, however, which the unthinking creature neither knows nor can express. Betty's eyes roved once or twice round the room during the singing, to see how the song was taken by the rest of the company. All listened, but she could perceive that some were bored and some others shocked. Others looked curiously grave. The music ceased, and the singer rose. Nobody proposed that she should sing again. "What do you think of the good taste of that?" one of Betty's cavaliers asked her softly. "Oh, don't talk about good taste. Who is she?" I don't know. I believe somebody said she was a teacher somewhere. She has tried her hand on us, hasn't she?" "A teacher?" Betty repeated the word, but gave no attention to the question. She was looking across the room at the musician, who was standing by the piano talking with a gentleman. The apartment was not so large but that she could see plainly, while it was large enough to save her from the charge of ill-bred staring. She saw a moderately tall figure, as straight as an Indian, with the head exquisitely set on the shoulders, and the head itself covered with an abundance of pale brown hair, disposed at the back in a manner of careless grace, which reminded Betty of a head of Sappho on an old gem in her possession. The face she could not see quite so well, for it was partly turned from her. Betty's attention centered on the figure and carriage. A pang of jealous rivalry shot through her as she looked. There was not a person in the room that carried her head so nobly, nor whose pose was so stately and graceful. Yet, stately as it was, it had no air of proud self-consciousness, nor of pride at all. It was not that. It was simple, maidenly dignity, not dignity aped. Betty read so much, and rapidly read what else she could see. She saw that the figure she was admiring was dressed but indifferently. The black silk had certainly seen its best days, if it was not exactly shabby. No ornaments whatever were worn with it. The fashion of garments at that day was, as I have remarked, very trying to any but a good figure, while it certainly showed such a one to advantage. Betty knew her own figure could bear comparison with most. The one she was looking at would bear comparison with any. Miss Gainsborough was standing in the most absolute quiet, the arms crossed over one another, with no ornament but their whiteness. "A good deal of aplomb there," whispered one of Betty's attendants, who saw whither her eyes had gone. "Aplomb," repeated Betty. "That is not aplomb." "Isn't it? Why not?" "It is something else," said Betty, eyeing still the figure she was commenting on. "You don't speak of balance, unless how shall I put it?" Don't you know what I mean?" "No," laughed her companion. "You might save me the trouble of telling you, if you were clever. You know you do not speak of balance, except where either the footing or the feet are somehow doubtful. You would not think of balance as belonging to a mountain." "A mountain?" said the other, looking over at Esther, and still laughing. "Yes. I grant you there is not much in common between the two things, only that element of undisturbableness. Do you know Miss Gainsborough?" "I have not the honor. I have never met her before." "I must know her. Who can introduce me?" And finding her hostess at this moment near her, Betty went on: "Dear Mrs. Chatsworth, do take me over and introduce me to Miss Gainsborough. I am filled with admiration and curiosity. But first, who is she?" "I really can tell you little. She is a great favorite of my friend Miss Fairbairn. That is how I came to know her. She teaches in Madame Duval's school. She is English, I believe. Miss Fairbairn says she is very highly accomplished, and I believe it is true." "Well, please introduce me. I am dying to know her." The introduction was made. The gentleman who had been talking to Miss Gainsborough withdrew. The two girls were left face to face. "Yes, what a face!" thought Betty, as soon as it was turned upon her, and with every minute of their being together the feeling grew. Not like any face she had ever seen in her life, Betty decided. What the difference was that took longer to determine. Good features, with refinement in every line of them, a fair, delicate skin, matching the pale brown hair, Betty had seen as good repeatedly. What she had not seen was what attracted her. The brow, broad and intellectual, had a most beautiful repose upon it, and from under it looked forth upon Betty two glorious gray eyes, pure, grave, thoughtful, penetrating, sweet. Yet more than all the rest, perhaps, which struck Miss Frere, was an expression, in mouth and eyes both, which is seen on no faces but of those who have gone through discipline and have learned the habit of self-renunciation, endurance, and loving ministry. The two girls sat down together at Betty's instance. "Will you forgive me?" she said. "I am a stranger, but I do want to ask you a question or two. May I? And will you hear me patiently?" "I see you will." The other made a courteous, half-smiling sign of assent, not as if she were surprised. Betty noticed that. "It is very bold for a stranger," she went on, making her observations while she spoke. "But the thing is earnest with me, and I must seize my chance, if it is a chance. It has happened," she lowered her voice somewhat and her words came slower. "It has happened that I have been studying the subject of religion a good deal lately. It interests me, and I want to ask you, why did you sing that hymn?" "That particular hymn?" No. I mean, why did you sing a hymn at all? It is not the usual thing, you know." "May I ask you a counter-question? What should be the motive with which one sings, or does anything of the sort?" "Motive? Why, to please people, I suppose." "And you think my choice was not happy?" "What does she ask me that for?" thought Betty. "She knows, just as well as I do, what people thought of it. What is she up to?" But aloud she answered: "I think it was very happy as regarded the choice of the hymn. It was peculiar, but very effective. My question meant, why did you sing a hymn at all?" "I will tell you," said the other. "I do not know if you will understand me. I sang that because I have given of myself to Christ, and my voice must be used only as His servant." Quick as thought it flashed upon Betty the words she had heard Pitt Dallas quote so lately, quote and descant upon, about giving his body a living sacrifice. "How you two think alike," was her instant reflection, "and how you would fit if you could come together, which you never shall, if I can prevent it." But her face showed only serious attention and interest. "I do not quite understand," she said. "Your words are so unusual. I cannot put my meaning in simpler words." "Then do you think it wrong to sing common songs? Those everybody sings?" "I cannot sing them," said Esther simply. My voice is Christ's servant." But the smile with which these, to Betty, severe words were spoken was entirely charming. There was not severity, but gladness upon every line of the curving lips, along with a trait of tenderness which touched Betty's heart. In all her life she had never had such a feeling of inferiority. She had given due reverence to persons older than herself. It was the fashion in those days. She had acknowledged a certain social precedence in ladies who were leaders of society and heads of families. She had never had such a feeling of being set down as before this young, pure, stately creature. Mentally, Betty, as it were, stepped down from the dais and stood with her arms folded over her breast, in the Eastern attitude of reverence, during the rest of the interview. "Then you do not do anything," said Betty incredulously, "if you cannot do it so?" "Not if I know it," the other said, smiling more broadly and with such archness. "But still, may I speak frankly? That does not tell me all. You know, you must know, that not everybody would like your choice of music?" "I suppose very few." "Would it do any good, in any way, to displease them?" "That is not the first question. The first question, in any case, is, how may I best do this thing for God, for His honor and His kingdom?" "I do not see what His honor and His kingdom have to do with it." "It is for His honor that His servants should obey Him, is it not?" said Esther with another smile. "And is it not for His kingdom that His invitations should be given?" "But here?" "Why not here?" "It is unusual." "I have no business to be anywhere where I cannot do it." "That sounds dreadful," said Betty honestly. "Why?" "Oh, it sounds strict, narrow, like a sort of slavery, as if one could never be free." "Free for what?" "Whatever one likes. I should be miserable if I felt I could not do what I liked." "Can you do it now?" said Esther. "Well, not always, but I am free to try," said Betty frankly. "Is that your definition of happiness? To try for that which you cannot attain?" "I do attain it, sometimes." "And keep it?" "Keep it? You cannot keep anything in this world. I do not think anything is happiness that you cannot keep." "But, if you come to that, what can you keep?" said Betty. Esther bent forward a little and said, with an intense gleam in her gray eyes, which seemed to dance and sparkle, "Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, and today, and forever." "I do not know Him," Betty breathed out, after staring at her companion. "I saw that." Esther rose, and Betty felt constrained to rise too. "Oh, are you going?" she cried. "I have not done talking. How can I know Him?" "Do you wish me to tell you?" "Indeed, yes. If you are in dead earnest and seek Him, He will reveal Himself to you. But then, you must be willing to obey every word He says. Good night." She offered her hand. Before Miss Frere, however, could take it, up came the lady of the house. "You are not going, Miss Gainsborough?" "My father would be uneasy if I stayed out late." "Oh, well, for once, what have you two been talking about? I saw several gentlemen casting longing looks in this direction, but they did not venture to interrupt. What were you discussing?" "Life in general," said Betty. "Life?" echoed the older woman, and her brow was instantly clouded. "What is the use of talking about that? Can either of you say that her life is not a failure?" "Miss Gainsborough will say that," replied Betty. "As for me, my life is a problem that I have not solved." "What do you mean by a failure, Mrs. Chatsworth?" the other girl asked. "Oh, just a failure. Turning out nothing. Coming to nothing. Nothing, I mean, that is satisfying. Tout laissé, tout cassé, tout passé. A true record. But isn't it sorrowful?" "I do not think it need be true," said Esther. Is it not true with you? No, certainly not. Your smile says more than your words. What a smile! My dear, I envy you. And yet I do not. You have got to wake up from all of that. You are 17, 18, 19, is it? And you have not found out yet that the world is hollow and your doll stuffed with sawdust. But the world is not all. Isn't it? What is? The Lord said, He that believeth in me hath everlasting life. Everlasting life? In the next world? Oh yes, my dear, but I was speaking of life now. Does not everlasting life begin now? Said Esther, with another of those rare smiles. They were so rare and so beautiful that Betty had come to watch for them. Arch, bright, above all happy, and full of a kind of loving power. The Lord said, hath, He did not say will have. Miss Gainsborough, you talk riddles. I am sorry, said Esther. I do not mean to do that. I am speaking the simplest truth. We were made to be happy in the love of God, and as we were made for that, nothing less will do. Are you happy? My dear, I need not ask. Your face speaks for you. I believe that pricked me on to ask the question with which we began, in pure envy. I see you are happy. But confess honestly now, honestly, and quite between ourselves, confess there is some delightful lover somewhere who provokes those smiles, with which no doubt you reward him? Esther's gray eyes opened unmistakably at her hostess while she was speaking, and then a light color rose on her cheek, and then she laughed. I neither have, nor ever expect to have, anything of the kind, she said, and then she was no longer to be detained, but took leave and went away. She is a little too certain about the lover, remarked Miss Frere. That looks as if there were already one in petto. She is poor, said Mrs. Chatsworth. She has not much chance. I believe she supports herself and her father. He is old or invalid or something. By teaching. Perhaps they have a little something to help her out. But I fancy she sees very little society. I never meet her anywhere. The lady in whose house she was educated is a very warm friend of hers, and she introduced her to me. So I get her to come here sometimes for a little change. Betty went home with a great many thoughts in her mind which kept her half the night awake. Jealousy perhaps pricked her the most. Not that Pitt loved this girl. About that Betty was not sure. But how he would love her if he could see her. How anybody would, especially a man of refined nature and truth of character, who requires the same in those connected with him. What a pure creature this was! And then she was not only tender, but strong. The look on her face, the lines of her lips, told surely of self-control, self-denial, and habitual patience. People do not look so who have all they need of this world's goods, and have always dipped their hands into full money-bags. No, Esther had something to bear, and something to do, both of which called for and called out that strength and sweetness. And yet she was so happy, happy after Pitt's fashion. And this was the girl he had been looking to find. Betty could deserve well of him by letting him know where to find her. But then all would be lost, and Betty's life a failure indeed. She could not face it. And besides, as things were, they were quite safe for the other two. The childish friendship had faded out. It would start up again, no doubt, if it had a chance. But there was no need that it should. Pitt was at least heart-whole, if not memory-free. And as for Esther, she had just declared a lover to be a possibility nowhere within the range of her horizon. Esther would not lose anything by not seeing Pitt any more. But then, would she lose nothing? The girl teaching to support herself and her father, alone and poor, what would it be to her life if Pitt suddenly came into it, with his strong hand and genial temper and plenty of means? What would it be to Betty's life if he went out of it? She turned and tossed, she battled and struggled with thoughts. But the end was, she went on to Washington without ever paying Esther a visit, or letting her know that her old friend was looking for her. End of chapter 39. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 40 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran-Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 40. London. The winter passed. In the spring, Betty received a letter from Mrs. Dallas, part of which ran as follows. My husband and I have a new plan on foot. We have been meditating it all winter, so it ought to be ripe now. We are going over to spend the summer in England. My son talked of making us a visit again this year, and we decided it was better we should go to him. Time is nothing to us, and to him it is something, for although he will have no need to practice in any profession, I agree with him and Mr. Dallas in thinking that it is good a young man should have a profession, and, at any rate, what has been begun had better be finished. So, sometime in May we think to leave Seaforth on our way to London. Dear Betty, will you take pity on an old woman and go with us, to give us the brightness of your youth? Don't you want to see London? And I presume by this time Pitt has qualified himself to be a good cicerone. Besides, we shall not be fixed in London. We will go to see whatever you would most like to see in the kingdom. Perhaps run up to Scotland. Of course, what I want to see is my boy, but other things would naturally have an attraction for you. Do not say no. It would be a great disappointment to me. Meet us in New York about the middle of May. Mr. Dallas wishes to go as soon as the spring storms are over. I have another reason for making this journey. I wish to keep Pitt from coming over to America. Betty's heart made a bound as she read this letter, and went on with faster beats than usual after she had folded it up. A voyage, and London, and Pitt Dallas for a showman. What could be more alluring in its temptation and promise? Going about in London with him to guide and explain things. Could opportunity be more favorable to finish the work which last summer left undone? Betty's heart jumped at it. She knew she would say yes to Mrs. Dallas. She could say nothing but yes. And yet, questions did come up to her. Would it not be putting herself unduly forward? Would it not look as though she went on purpose to see, not London, but somebody in London? That would be the very truth, Betty confessed to herself, with a pang of shame and humiliation. The pang was keen, yet it did not change her resolution. What if? Nobody knew, she argued, and nobody would have cause to suspect. There was reason enough, ostensible, why she should go to England with Mrs. Dallas. If she refused to visit all the old ladies who had sons, her social limits would be restricted indeed. But Mrs. Dallas herself, would not she understand? Mrs. Dallas understood enough already, Betty said to herself defiantly. They were allies in this cause. It was very miserable that it should be so. However, not now to be undone or set aside. Lightly she had gone into Mrs. Dallas's proposition last summer. If it had grown to be life and death earnest with her, there was no need that Mrs. Dallas should know that. It was life and death earnest, and she must go to London. It was a capital plan. To have met Pitt Dallas again at Seaforth, and again spent weeks in his mother's house while he was there, would have been too obvious. This was better every way. Of course she could not refuse such an invitation, such a chance of seeing something of the world. She who had always been too poor to travel. Pitt could not find any matter of surprise nor any ground for criticism in her doing that, and it would give her all the opportunity she wished for. Here, most inopportunely, came before her the image of Esther. How those two would suit each other! How infallibly Pitt would be devoted to her if he could see her! But Betty said to herself that she had a better right. They did not know each other. He was nothing to Esther. Esther was nothing to him. She set her teeth and wrote to Mrs. Dallas that she would be delighted to go. And then, having made her choice, she put away thought. All through the voyage she was the most delightful companion. A little stifled excitement, like forcing heat in a greenhouse, made all her social qualities blossom out in unwonted brilliancy. She was entertaining, bright, gay, witty, graceful. She was the admiration and delight of the whole company on board, and Mrs. Dallas thought to herself with proud satisfaction that Pitt could find nothing better than that, nor more attractive, and that she need wish nothing better than that at the head of her son's household, and by his side. That Pitt could withstand such enchantment was impossible. She was doing the very best thing she could do in coming to England and in bringing Betty with her. Having meditated this journey for months, Mr. Dallas had made all his preparations. Rooms had been engaged in a pleasant part of the city, and there, very soon after landing, the little party found themselves comfortably established and quite at home. "Nothing like England," Mr. Dallas grumbled with satisfaction. "You couldn't do this in New York. They understand nothing about it, and they are too stupid to learn. I believe there isn't a lodging house in all the little Dutch city over there. You could not find a single house where they let lodgings in the English fashion." "Mr. Dallas, it is not a Dutch city." "Half Dutch, and that's enough. Have you let Pitt know we are here, wife?" Mrs. Dallas had done that, but the evening passed away, nevertheless, without any news of him. They made themselves very comfortable, had an excellent dinner, and went to rest in rooms pleasant and well appointed. But Betty was in a state of feverish excitement, which would not let her be a moment at ease. Now she was here, she almost was ready to wish herself back again. How would Pitt look at her? How would he receive her? And yet, what affair was it of his, if his mother brought a young friend with her, to enjoy the journey and make it agreeable? It was nothing to Pitt. And yet, if it were nothing to him, Betty would want to take passage in the next packet ship sailing for New York or Boston. She drew her breath short until she could see him. He came about the middle of the next morning. Mr. Dallas had gone out, and the two ladies were alone, in a high state of expectancy, joyous on one part, most anxious and painful on the other. The first sight of him calmed Betty's heart beating. At the same time it gave her a great thrill of pain. Pitt was himself so frank and so quiet, she said to herself, there was no occasion for her to fear anything in his thoughts. His greeting of her was entirely cordial and friendly. He was neither surprised nor displeased to see her. At the same time, while this was certainly comforting, Pitt looked too composedly happy for Betty's peace of mind. Apparently he needed neither her nor anybody. "Do men ever?" said Betty to herself bitterly. And besides, there was in his face and manner a nobleness and a pureness which at one blow drove home, as it were, the impression of the last year. Such a look she had never seen on any face in her life, except— yes, there was one exception, and the thought sent another pang of pain through her. But women do not show what they feel. And Pitt, if he noticed Miss Frere at all, saw nothing but the well-bred quiet which always belonged to Betty's demeanor. He was busy with his mother. "This is a pleasure to have you here," he was saying heartily. "I thought we should have seen you last night. My letter was in time. Didn't you get it?" "It went to my chambers in the Temple, and I was not there." "Where were you?" "At Kensington." "At Kensington? With Mr. Strahan?" "Not with Mr. Strahan," said Pitt gravely. "I have been with him a great deal these last weeks. You got my letter in which I told you he was ill?" "Yes, and that you were nursing him." "Then you did not get my letter telling of the end of his illness? You left home before it arrived." "You do not mean that Uncle Strahan is dead?" "It is a month ago or more. But there is nothing to regret, Mother. He died perfectly happy." Mrs. Dallas passed over this sentence, which she did not like, and asked abruptly, "Then what were you doing at Kensington?" "There was business. I have been obliged to give some time to it. You will be as much surprised as I was to learn that my old uncle has left all he had in the world to me." "To you?" Mrs. Dallas did not utter a scream of delight or embrace her son, or do anything that many women would have done in honor of the occasion. But her head took a little loftier set upon her shoulders, and in her cheeks rose a very pretty rosy flush. "I am not surprised in the least," she said. "I do not see how he could have done anything else. But I did not know the old gentleman had so much sense for all that. Is the property large?" "Rather large." "My dear, I am very glad. That makes you independent at once. I do not know whether I ought to be glad of that. But you would never be let off from any line of conduct you thought fit to enter, by either having or wanting money. I hope not. It is not high praise to say that I am not mercenary. Who was thinking to bribe me? And to what? Never mind, said Mrs. Dallas hastily. Was not the house at Kensington part of the property? Certainly. And has that come to you too? Yes, of course, just as it stood. I was going to ask if you would not move in and take possession? Take possession? We? Yes, Mother. It is all ready. The old servants are there and will take very passably good care of you. Mrs. Bunce can cook a chop and boil an egg and make a piece of toast. Let me see, what else can she do? Everything that my old uncle liked, I know. Beyond that, I cannot say how far her power extends, but I think she can make you comfortable. My dear, aren't you going to let the house? No, Mother. Why not? You cannot live in chambers in there too. I can never let the house. In the first place, it is too full of things which have all of them more or less value, many of them more. In the second place, the old servants have their home there, and will always have it. You are bound by the will? Not at all. The will binds me to nothing. Then, my dear boy, it may be a long time before you would want to set up housekeeping there yourself. You might never wish it. And in the meantime, all this expense going on? I know what Uncle Strahan would have liked, Mamma, but apart from that, I could never turn adrift his old servants. They are devoted to me now. And, besides, I wish to have the house taken care of. When you have seen it, you will not talk any more about having it let. You will come at once, will you not? It is better than this. I told Mrs. Bunce she might make ready for you, and there is a special room for Miss Frere, where she may study several things. He gave a pleasant glance at the young lady as he spoke, which certainly assured her of a welcome, but Betty felt painfully embarrassed. This is something we never contemplated, she said, turning to Mrs. Dallas. What will you do with me? I have no right to Mr. Pitt's hospitality, generous as it is. You will come with us, of course, said Mrs. Dallas. You are one of us as much as anybody could be. And you would be very sorry afterwards if you did not, I can tell you, said Pitt frankly. My old house is quite something to see, and I promise myself some pleasure in the enjoyment you all will have in it. I hope we are so much old friends that you would not refuse me such an honor? There was no more to say, after the manner in which this was spoken, and from embarrassment Betty went over to great exultation. What could be better than this? And did even her dreams offer her such a bewildering prospect of pleasure? She heard with but half an ear what Pitt and his mother were saying, yet she did hear it, and lost not a word, braiding in her own reflections diligently with the thoughts thus suggested. They talked of Mr. Strahan, of his illness, through which Pitt had nursed him, of the studies thus interrupted, of the property thus suddenly come into Pitt's hands. I do not see why you should go on with your law reading, Mrs. Dallas broke out at last. Really, why should you? You are perfectly independent already, without any help from your father. House and servants and all, and money enough. Your father would say, too much. Haven't you thought of giving up your chambers in the Temple? No, Mother. Any other young man would. Why not you? What do you want to study law for any more? One must do something, you know. Something? But I never heard that law was an amusing study. Is it not the driest of the dry? Rather dry, in spots. What is your notion, then, Pitt, if you do not like it? I do like it, and I am thinking of the use it may be. The use? Said Mrs. Dallas, bewilderedly. It is a grand profession, he went on. A grand profession when used for its legitimate purposes. I want to have the command of it. If the study is sometimes dry, the practice is often, or it often may be, in the highest degree interesting. Purposes? What purposes? Mrs. Dallas pursued, fastening on that one word in Pitt's speech. Righting the wrong, Mother, and lifting up the oppressed. A knowledge of law is necessary often for that. and the practice too." "Pitt," said his mother, "I don't understand you." Betty thought she did, and she was glad that Mr. Dallas's entrance broke off the conversation. Then it was all gone over again. Mr. Strahan's illness, Pitt's ministrations, the will, the property, the house, concluding with the plan of removing thither. Betty, saying nothing herself, watched the other members of the party. The gleam in Mr. Dallas's money-loving eyes, the contained satisfaction of Mrs. Dallas's motherly pride, and the extremely different look on the younger man's face. With all the brightness and life of his talk to them, with all the interest and pleasure he showed in the things talked about, there was a quiet apartness on his brow and in his eyes, a lift above trifles, a sweetness and a gravity that certainly found their ailment neither in the sudden advent of a fortune nor in any of the accessories of money. Betty saw and read while the others were talking, and her outward calm and careless demeanor was no true indication of how she felt. The very things which drew her to Pitt, alas, made her feel set away at a distance from him. What had her restless soul in common with that happy repose that was about him? And yet, how restlessness is attracted by rest! Of all things it seemed to Betty one of the most delightful and desirable, not to be fretted, not to be anxious, to be never out of sorts, never seemingly discontented with anything or afraid of anything, while these terms were the very reverse of all which must describe her and everyone else whom she knew. Where did that high calm come from? No face that Betty had ever seen had that look upon it, except— oh, she wished she had never seen that other, or that she could forget it. Those two fitted together. But I should make him just as good a wife, said Betty to herself. Perhaps better. And she does not care, and I do. Oh, what a fool I was ever to go into this thing. End of chapter 40. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 41 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 41. An Old House. Arrangements were soon made. The landlady of the house was contented with a handsome bonus. Baggage was sent off. A carriage was ordered, and the party set forth. It was a very strange experience to Betty. If her position was felt to be a little awkward, at the same time it was most deliciously adventurous and novel. She sat demurely enough by Mrs. Dallas's side, eyeing the strange streets through which they passed, hearing every word that was spoken by anybody, and keeping the while herself an extremely smooth and careless exterior. She was full of interest for all she saw, and yet the girls saw it as in a dream, or only as a background upon which she saw Pitt. She saw him always, without often seeming to look at him. The content of Mr. and Mrs. Dallas was inexpressible. "Where will you find anything like that now?" said Mr. Dallas, as they were passing Hyde Park. "Ah, Miss Betty, wait. You will never want to see Washington again. The Capitol? Pooh, pooh! It may do for a little beginning of a colony, but wait till you have seen a few things here. What will you show her first, Pitt?" "Kensington." "Kensington? Ah, to be sure. Well, I suppose your new house takes precedence of all other things for the present." "Not my new house," said Pitt. "It is anything but that. There is nothing new about it but the master. I thought I should bring you back with me, Mother, so I told Mrs. Bunce to have luncheon ready. As I said, she can cook a chop." By degrees the houses became thinner as they drove on. Grass and trees were again prominent, and it was in a region that looked at least half country that the carriage at last stopped. Indeed, more than half country, for the city was certainly left behind. Everything was in fresh green. The air was mild and delicious, the place quiet. The carriage turned from the road and passed through an iron gateway and up a gravel sweep to the door of an old house, shaded by old trees and surrounded by a spread of velvety turf. The impression, as Betty descended from the carriage, was that here had been ages of dignified order and grave tranquillity. The green sward was even and soft and of vivid freshness. The old trees were stately with their length of limb and great solid trunks. And the house? The house, towards which she turned, as if to ask questions of it, was of moderate size, built of stone, and so massively built as if it had been meant to stand forever. That was seen at once in the thickness of the walls, the strong oaken doorway, and the heavy window frames. But as soon as Betty set foot within the door, she could almost have screamed with delight. "Upon my word, very good, very well," said Mr. Dallas, standing in the hall and reviewing it. And then, perceiving the presence of the servants, he checked himself and reviewed them. "These are my uncle's faithful old friends, Mother," Pitt was saying. "Mrs. Bunce and Stephen Hill. Have you got something ready for travelers, Mrs. Bunce?" Dignified order and grave tranquillity was the impression on Betty's mind again, as they were ushered into the dining room. It was late, and the party sat down at once to table. But Betty could hardly eat for feasting her eyes, and when they went upstairs to their rooms, that feast still continued. The house was irregular, with rather small rooms and low ceilings, which itself was pleasant after the more commonplace regularity to which Miss Frere had been accustomed. And then it was full. All the rooms were full of quaintness and beauty. Oak wainscotings, dark with time, oaken doorways with singular carvings, chimney pieces, before which Betty stood in speechless delight and admiration, small pane windows set in deep window niches. In one or two rooms dark draperies, but the late Mr. Strahan had not favored anything that shut out the light, and in most of the house there were no curtains put up. And then, on the walls, in cupboards and presses, on tables and shelves, and in cabinets, there was an endless variety and wealth of treasures and curiosities, pictures, bronzes, coins, old armor, old weapons, curiosities of historical value, others of natural production, others still of art. Some of all these were very valuable and precious. To examine them must be the work of many days. It was merely the fact of their being there which Betty took in now, with a sense of the great riches of the new mental pasture ground in which she found herself. She changed her dress in a kind of breathless mood, noticing as she did so the old-fashioned and aged furniture of her room. Aged, not infirm. The manufacture solid and strong as ever. The wood darkened by time, the patterns quaint, but to Betty's eye the more picturesque. Her apartment was a corner room, with one deep window on each of two sides. The lookout over a sunny landscape of grass, trees, and scattered buildings. On another side was a deep chimney place, with curious wrought iron fire dogs. What a delightful adventure, or what a terrible adventure, was it which had brought her to this house? She would not think of that. She dressed and went down. The rest of the party were gathered in the library, and this room finished Betty's enchantment. It was a well-sized room, the largest in the house, on the second floor, and all the properties that made the house generally interesting were gathered and culminated here. Dark wainscoting, dark bookcases, and dark books gave it an aspect that might have been gloomy, yet was not so, perhaps because of the many other objects in the room, which gave points of light or bits of color. What they were, Betty could only find out by degrees. She saw at once, in general, that this must have been a favorite place of the late owner, and that here he had collected a special assemblage of the things that pleased him best. A table at one side must have been made, she thought, about the same time with her chamber furniture, and by the same hand. The floor was dark and polished, and on it lay here and there bits of soft carpeting, which were well worn. Betty advanced slowly to the corner where the party were sitting, taking in the effect of all this, then almost started as Pitt gave her a chair, to see in the corner just beyond the group a stuffed bear showing his teeth at her. The father and mother had been talking about various matters at home, and the talk went on. Betty presently left them and began to examine the sides of the room. She studied the bear, which was in an upright position, resting one paw on a stick, while the other supported a lamp. From the bear her eyes passed on to a fire screen, which stood before the empty chimney, and then she went to look at it nearby. It was a most exquisite thing. 2 great panes of plate glass were so set in a frame that a space of some 3 or 4 inches separated them. In this space, in every variety of position, were suspended on invisible wires some 20 hummingbirds of different kinds, and whether the light fell upon the screen in front or came through it from behind, the display was in either case most beautiful and novel. Betty at last wandered to the chimney-piece, and went no further for a good while, studying the rich carving and the coat of arms which was both sculptured and painted in the midst of it. By and by she found that Pitt was beside her. "Mr. Strahan's?" she asked. "No, they belong to a former possessor of the house. It came into my uncle's family by the marriage of his father." "It is very old?" "Pretty old. That is, what in America we would call so. It reaches back to the time of the Stuarts. Really, that is not so long ago as it seems." "It is worth while to be old if it gives one such a chimney-piece as that. But I should not like another man's arms in it if I were you." "Why not?" "I don't know. I believe it diminishes the sense of possession." "A good thing, then," said Pitt. "Do you remember that 'they that have' are told to be as though they possessed not?" "How can they?" answered Betty, looking at him. "You know the words?" "I seem to have read them. I suppose I have." "Then there must be some way of making them true." "What is this concerned, Pitt?" inquired his father, who had followed them and was looking at a sort of cabinet which was framed into the wall. "I was going to invite Miss Fair's attentions to it, yet, on reflection, I believe she is not enthusiastic for that sort of thing." "That is valuable, father. It is a collection of early Greek coins. Uncle Strahan was very fond of that collection and very proud of it. He had brought it together with a great deal of pains." "Rubbish, I should say," observed the elder man, and he moved on, while Betty took his place. "Now, I do not understand them," she said. "You can see the beauty of some of them. Look at this head of Apollo." "That is beautiful, exquisite. Was that a common coin of trade?" "Doubtful, in this case. It is not certain that this was not rather a medal struck for the members of the Amphictyonic Council. But see this coin of Syracuse. This was a common coin of trade, only of a size not the most common. All I can say is, their coinage was far handsomer than ours, if it was like that. The reverse is as fine as the obverse, a chariot with 4 horses, done with infinite spirit." "How can you remember what is on the other side? I suppose this side is what you mean by the obverse of this particular coin? Are you sure?" Pitt produced a key from his pocket, unlocked the glass door of the cabinet, and took the coin from its bed. On the other side was what he had stated to be there. Betty took the piece in her hands to look and admire. "That is certainly very fine," she said, but her attention was not entirely bent on the coin. "Is this lovely head meant for Apollo too?" "No, don't you see it is feminine? Ceres, it is thought, but Mr. Strahan held that it was Arethusa, in honor of the nymph that presided over the fine fountain of sweet water near Syracuse. The coinage of that city was extremely beautiful and diversified, yielding to hardly any other in design and workmanship. Here is an earlier one. You see the very different stage art had attained to." "A regular Greek face," remarked Betty, going back to the coin she held in her hand. "See the straight line of the nose and the very short upper lip. Do you hold that the Greek type is the only true beauty?" "Not I. The only true beauty, I think, is that of the soul, or at least that which the soul shines through." "What are these little fish swimming about the head? They would seem to indicate a marine deity." "The dolphin, the Syracusan emblem." "I wish I had been born in those times," said Betty, and the wish had a meaning in the speaker's mind which the hearer could not divine. "Why do you wish that?" asked Pitt, smiling. "I suppose the principal reason is that then I should not have been born in this. Everything is dreadfully prosy in our age. Oh, not here, at this moment, but this is a fairy tale we are living through. I know how the plain world will look when I go back to it." At present, said Pitt, taking the Syracusan coin and restoring it to its place, you are not an enthusiastic numismatist. No, how should I? Coins are not a thing to excite enthusiasm. They are beautiful and curious, but not exactly stirring. I had a scholar once, remarked Pitt, as he locked the glass door of a cabinet, whose eyes would have opened very wide at sight of this collection. Have you heard anything of the Gainsboroughs, Mother? Betty started, inwardly, and was seized with an unreasoning fear lest the question might next be put to herself. Quietly, as soon as she could, she moved away from the coin cabinet, and seemed to be examining something else, but she was listening all the while. Nothing whatever, Mrs. Dallas had answered. They have not come back to England. I have made out so much. I looked up the family after I came home last fall. Their headquarters are at a nice old place down in Devonshire. I introduced myself and got acquainted with them. They are pleasant people, but they knew nothing of the Colonel. He has not come home, and he has not written. Thus much I have found out. It is not certain, however, grumbled Mr. Dallas. I believe he has come home, that is, to England. He was on bad terms with his people, you know. When are you going to show Miss Frere and me London? Asked Mrs. Dallas. She was as willing to lead off from the other subject as Betty herself. Show you London, Mamma? Show you a bit of it, you mean. It would take something like a lifetime to show you London. What bit will you begin with? What first, Betty? Said Mrs. Dallas. Betty turned and slowly came back to the others. Take her to see the lions in the tower, suggested Mr. Dallas, and the waxwork. Do you think I have never seen a lion, Mr. Dallas? Said the young lady. Well, small ones, said the gentleman, stroking his chin. But the tower is a big lion itself. I believe I should like to go to the tower. I have never been there yet, old as I am. I do not want to go to the tower, said Mrs. Dallas. I do not care for that kind of thing. I should like to see the temple, and Pitt's chambers. So should I, said the younger lady. You might do worse, said Pitt. Then tomorrow we will go to the temple and to St. Paul's. St. Paul's? That will not hold us long, will it? Said Betty. Is it so much to see? A good deal if you go through and study the monuments. Well, said Betty, I suppose it will be all delightful. But when she had retired to her room at night, her mood was not just so. She sat down before her glass and ruminated. That case of coins, and Pitt's old scholar, and the Gainsboroughs, who had not come home. He would find them yet. Yes, and Esther would one day be standing before those coins, and Pitt would be showing them to her, and she would enter into his talk about them, and would understand and have sympathy, and there would be sympathy on other points too. If Esther ever stood there, in that beautiful old library, it would be as mistress and at home. Betty had a premonition of it. She put her hands before her eyes to shut out the picture. Suppose she earned well of the two and gained their lasting friendship by saying the words that would bring them to each other. That was one way out of her difficulty. But then, why should she? What right had Esther Gainsborough to be happy more than Betty Frere? The other way out of her difficulty, namely, to win Pitt's liking, would be much better, and then they both of them might be Esther's friends. For of one thing Betty was certain. If she could win Pitt, he would be won. No halfway work was possible with him. He would never woo a woman he did not entirely love, and any woman so loved by him would not need to fear any other woman. It would be once for all. Betty had never, as it happened, met thoroughgoing truth before. She recognized it and trusted it perfectly in Pitt, and it was one of the things, she confessed to herself, that drew her most mightily to him. A person whom she could absolutely believe and always be sure of. Whom else in the world could she trust so? Not her own brothers, not her own father. Mother she had none. How did she know so securely that Pitt was an exception to the universal rule? The question might be asked, and she asked it. She had not seen him tested in any great thing. But she had seen him tried in little bits of everyday things, in which most people think it is no harm to dodge the truth a little, and Betty recognized the soundness of the axiom, "He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much." End of chapter 41. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona.
Chapter 42 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner. Chapter 42, The Tower. The next morning they went to inspect the temple, Pitt and the two ladies. Mr. Dallas preferred some other occupation, but the interest brought to the inspection was not altogether legitimate. Mrs. Dallas cared principally to see how comfortable her son's chambers were, and to refresh herself with the tokens of antiquity and importance which attached to the place and the institution to which he belonged. Betty was no antiquarian in the best of times, and at present had all her faculties concentrated on one subject and one question which was not of the past. Nevertheless, it is of the nature of things that a high strain of the mind renders it intensely receptive and sensitive for outward impressions, even though they may not be welcomed, like a taut string, which answers to a breath breathed upon it. Betty did not care for the temple, had no interest in the old Templars' arms on the sides of the gateways, and thought its medley of dull courts and lanes a very undesirable place. What was it to her where Dr. Johnson had lived? She did not care for Dr. Johnson at all, and as little for Oliver Goldsmith. Pitt, she saw, cared. How odd it was! It was some comfort that Mrs. Dallas shared her indifference. "My dear," she said, "I do not care about anybody's lodgings but yours. Dr. Johnson is not there now, I suppose. Where are your rooms?" But Pitt laughed and took them first to the Temple Church. Here Betty could not refuse to look and be interested a little. How little she did not show. The beauty of the old church, its venerable age, and the strange relics of the past in its monuments did command some attention. Yet Betty grudged it, and went over the halls and the courts afterward with a half-reluctant foot, hearing as if against her will all that Pitt was telling her and his mother about them. Oh, what did it matter that one of Shakespeare's plays had been performed in the Middle Temple Hall during its author's lifetime? And what did it signify whether a given piece of architecture were early English or perpendicular Gothic? What did interest her was to see how lively and warm was Pitt's knowledge and liking of all these things. Evidently he delighted in them and was full of information concerning them, and his interest did move Betty a little. It moved her to speculation also. Could this man be so earnest in his enjoyment of Norman arches and polished shafts and the effigies of old knights, and still hold the views and principles he had avowed and advocated last year? Could he, who took such pleasure in the doings and recordings of the past, really mean to attach himself to another sort of life, which with the honors and dignities and delights of this common world have nothing to do? The question recurred again afresh on their return home. As Betty entered the house, she was struck by the beauty of the carved oak staircase, and exclaimed upon it. "Yes," said Pitt, "this is the prettiest part of the house. It is said to be by Inigo Jones, but perhaps that cannot be proved." "Does it matter?" said Betty, laughing. "No, not to any real lover of it, but to the rest. You know, the name is the thing." "Lover of it?" said Betty. "Can you love a staircase?" Pitt laughed out. Then he answered seriously, "Don't you know that all is good and true, in a way bound up together? It is one whole, and I take it to be certain that in proportion to anyone's love for spiritual and moral beauty will be cateris paribus, his appreciation of all expression of it, in nature or art." "But," said Betty, "spiritual and moral beauty? You do not mean that this oak staircase is an expression of either?" "Of course, perhaps. At any rate, the things are very closely connected." "You are an enigma," said Betty. "I hope not always to remain so," he answered. Betty went up the beautiful staircase, noting as she went its beauties from story to story. She had not noticed it before, although it really took up more room than was proportionate to the size of the house. What did Pitt mean by those last words? She was querying. And could it be possible that the owner of a house like this, with a property corresponding, would not be of the world and live in the world like other men? He must, Betty thought. It is all very well for people who have not the means to make a figure in society to talk of isolating themselves from society. A man may give up a little, but when he has much, he holds on to it. But how was it with Pitt? She must try and find out. She accordingly made an attempt that same evening, beginning with the staircase again. I admired Inigo Jones all the way upstairs, she said, when she had an opportunity to talk to Pitt alone. Mr. Dallas had gone to sleep after dinner, and his wife was knitting at a sufficient distance. The quaint fancies and delicate work are really such as I never imagined before in wood carving. But your words about it remain a puzzle to me. My words? About art being an expression of truth? Surely that is not new. It may be very old, but I do not understand it. You understand that so far as art is genuine, it is a setter forth of truth? Well, I suppose so, of some truth. Roses must be roses, and trees must be trees, and of course must look as like the reality as possible. That is the very lowest thing art can do, and in some cases is not true art at all. Her business is to tell truth, never to deceive. What sort of truth, then? What I said, spiritual and moral. Ah, there it is. Now you have got back to it. Now you are talking mystery, or forgive me, transcendentalism. No, nothing but simple and very plain fact. It is this first, that all truth is one, and this next, that in the world of creation, things material are the expression of things spiritual. So all real beauty in form or color has back of it a greater beauty of higher degree. You are talking pure mystery. No, surely, said Pitt eagerly. You certainly recognize the truth of what I'm saying in some things. For instance, you cannot look up steadily into the blue infinity of one of our American skies on a clear day, at least I cannot, without presently getting the impression of truth, pure, unfailing, incorruptible truth in its creator. The rose, everywhere in the world, so as far as I know, is the accepted emblem of love, and of another very familiar instance. Christ is called in the Bible the Son of Righteousness, the light that is the life of man. Do you know how close to fact that is? What this earth would be if deprived of the sun for a few days is but a true image of the condition of any soul finally forsaken by the Son of Righteousness. In one word, death. And that is what the Bible means by death, of which the death we commonly speak of is again but a faint image. Betty fidgeted a little. This was not what she wished to speak of. It was getting away from her point. Your staircase set me wondering about you, she said boldly, not answering his speech at all. In yet another connection, said Pitt, smiling. In another connection. You remember you used to talk to me pretty freely last summer about your new views and plans of life. I remember. But my staircase. Yes, your staircase. You know, it is rich and stately, as well as beautiful, whatever it signifies to you. To my lower vision, it means a position in the world, and the means to maintain it. And I debated with myself as I went up the stairs, whether the owner of all this would still think it his duty to live altogether for others, and not for himself, like common people. She looked at him, and Pitt met her inquiring eyes with a steady, penetrating, grave look, which half made her wish she had let the question alone. He delayed his answer a little, and then he said, Will you let me meet that doubt in my own way? Certainly, said Betty, surprised. If you will forgive me, its arising. Is one responsible for doubts? One may be responsible for the state of mind from which they spring. Then if you will allow me, I will say no more on the subject for a day or two. But I will not leave you unanswered. That is, unless you refuse to submit to my guidance. and will not let me take you my own way. You are mysterious. Will you go with me when I ask you? Yes? Then that is sufficient. Betty thought she had not gained much by her move. The next day was given to the Tower. Mrs. Dallas did not go. Her husband was of the party instead. The inspection of the place was thorough and occupied some hours. Pitt, being able, through an old friend of Mr. Strahan's, was now also his friend, to obtain an order from the constable for seeing the whole. At dinner Betty delivered herself of her opinion. "Were you busy all day with nothing but the Tower?" asked Mrs. Dallas. "Stopped for luncheon," said her husband. "And we did our work thoroughly, Mamma," added Pitt. "You must take time if you want to see anything." "Well," said Betty, "I must say, if this is what it means to live in an old country, I am thankful I live in a new one." "What now?" asked Mr. Dallas. "What's the matter?" Mrs. Dallas was wiser that she did not go. Betty went on. "I have supped full of horrors. Really, I have read history, but that gives it to one deluded. I had no notion that the English people were so savage." Come, no worse than other people," Mr. Dallas put in. "I do not know how it is with the other people. I am thankful we have no such monument in America. I shouldn't think snow would lie on the Tower." "Doesn't often," said Pitt. "Think, Mrs. Dallas, I stood in that little chapel there, the prisoners' chapel, and beneath the pavement lay between 30 and 40 people, the remains of them, who lay there with their heads separated from their bodies, and some of them with no heads at all. The heads had been set up on London Bridge or on Temple Bar or some other dreadful place. And then as we went round, I was told that here was the spot where Lady Jane Grey was beheaded, and there was the window from which she saw the headless body of her husband carried away, and there stood the rack on which Anne Askew was tortured, and there was the prison where Arabella Stuart died insane, and here was the axe which was used to be carried before the lieutenant when he took a prisoner to his trial, and was carried before the prisoner when he returned, mostly with the sharp edge turned towards him. I do not see how people used to live in those times. There are Anne Boleyn and her brother, Lady Jane Grey and her husband, and other Dudleys innumerable." "My dear, do stop. I cannot eat my dinner, and you cannot." "Eat dinner? Did anybody used to eat dinner in those times? Did the world go on as usual, with such horrors on the throne and in the dungeon?" "It's a great national monument," said Mr. Dallas, "that any people might be proud of." "Proud? Well, I am glad, as I said, that the sky is blue over America." "The blue looks down on nothing so fine as our old Tower, and it isn't so blue either, if you could know all." "Where are you going to take us next, Pitt?" Mrs. Dallas asked, to give things a pleasanter turn. "How did you like St. Paul's, Miss Betty?" her husband went on before Pitt could speak. "It's very black." "That is one of its beauties," remarked Pitt. "Is it? But I am accustomed to pure air. I do not like so much smoke." "You were interested in the monuments?" said Mrs. Dallas. "Honestly, I am not fond of monuments. Besides, there really is a reminiscence of the Tower and the axe there very often. I had no conception London was such a place." "Let us take her to Hyde Park and show her something cheerful, Pitt. I should love above all things to go to the House of Commons and hear a debate, if it could be managed." Pitt said it could be managed, and it was managed, and they went to the park, and they drove out to see some of the beauties near London, Richmond, Hampton Court, and Windsor, and several days passed away in great enjoyment for the whole party. Betty forgot the Tower and grew gay. The strangeness of her position was forgotten. The house came to be familiar. The alternation of sightseeing with the quiet household was delightful. Nothing could be better. Might it last? Could it not last? Nay, Betty would have relinquished the sightseeing and bargained for only the household life, if she could have retained that. End of chapter 42. Recording by Yvonne Theodore. Chapter 43 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner. Chapter 43, Martin's Court. What is for today, Pitt? There had been a succession of rather gay days, visiting of galleries and palaces. Mrs. Dallas put the question at breakfast. I am going to show Miss Freer something, if she will allow me. She will allow you, of course. You have done it pretty often lately. Where is it now? Nowhere for you, Mamma. My show today is for Miss Freer alone. Alone? Why may I not go? You would not enjoy it. Then perhaps she will not enjoy it. Perhaps not. But, Pitt, what do you mean? And what is this you want to show her which she does not want to see? She can tell you about it afterwards if she chooses. Perhaps she will not choose to go with you on such a doubtful invitation. Betty, however, declared herself ready for anything, so she was, under such guidance. They took a cab for a certain distance, then Pitt dismissed it, and they went forward on foot. It was a dull, hot day, clouds hanging low and threatening rain, but no rain falling as yet. Rain, if decided to a good degree, keeps down exhalations in the streets of a city, and so far is a help to the wayfarer who is at all particular about the air he breathes. No such beneficent influence was abroad today, and Betty's impressions were not altogether agreeable. What part of the city is this? She asked. Not a bad part at all. In fact, we are near a very fashionable quarter. This particular street is a business thoroughfare, as you see. Betty was silent, and they went on for a while, then turned sharp out of this thoroughfare into a narrow alley. It was hot and close, and dank enough here to make Miss Freer shrink, though she would not betray it. But dead cats and decaying cabbage leaves in a not very clean alley, where the sun rarely shines, and briefly then, with the thermometer well up, on a summer day, altogether make an atmosphere not suited to delicate senses. Pitt picked the way along the narrow passage, which at the end opened into a little court. This was somewhat cleaner than the alley. Also, it lay so that the sun sometimes visited it, though here too his visits could be but brief. For on the opposite side the court was shut in, and overshadowed by the tall backs of great houses. They seemed to Betty's fancy to cast as much moral as physical shadow over the place. The houses in this court were small and dingy. If one looked straight up, there was a space of grey cloud visible. Some days it would no doubt be a space of blue sky. No other thing even dimly suggesting refreshment or purity was within the range of vision. Pitt slowly paced along the row of houses. Who lives here? Betty asked, partly to relieve the oppression that was creeping upon her. No householders that I know of. People who live in one room, or perhaps in 2 rooms. Therefore in every house there are a number of families. This is Martin's Court, and here, he stopped before one of the doors, in this house, in a room on the 3rd floor, let me suppose a case. 3rd floor? Why, there are only 2 stories. In the garret, then, there lives an old woman, over 70 years old, all alone. She has been ill for a long time and suffers a great deal of pain. Who takes care of her? Betty asked, wondering at the same time why Pitt was telling her all this. She has no means to pay anybody to take care of her. How does she live, if she cannot do anything for herself? She can do nothing at all for herself. She has been dependent on the kindness of her neighbors. They are poor too, and they have their hands full. Still, from time to time, one and another would look in upon her, light a fire for her, and give her something to eat, that is, when they did not forget it. And what if they did forget? Then she must wait till somebody remembered, wait perhaps days to get her bed made, lie alone in her pain all day, except for those rare visits, and even have to hire a boy with a penny to bring her a pitcher of water, lie alone all night and wait in the morning till somebody could give her her breakfast. "Why do you tell me all this, Mr. Pitt?" said Betty, facing round on him. "Ask me that by and by. Come a little farther. Here, in this next house but one, there is a man sick with rheumatism, in a fever. When I first saw him, he was lying there shivering and in great pain, with no fire, and his daughter, a girl of perhaps a dozen years old, was trying to light a fire with a few splinters of sticks that she had picked up. That was this last winter, in cold weather. They were poverty-stricken, since the man had been some time out of work." "Well," said Betty, "I must not repeat my question, but what is this all to me? I have no power to help them. Do you know these people yourself?" "Yes, I know them. In the last house of the row there is another old woman I want to tell you of, and then we will go. She is not ill nor disabled. She is only very old and quite alone. She is not unhappy either, for she is a true old Christian. But think of this. In the room which she occupies, which is half underground, there is just 1 hour in the day when a sunbeam can find entrance. For that hour she watches, and when the sky is not clouded, and it comes, she takes her Bible and holds it in the sunshine to read for that blessed hour. It is all she has in the 24. The rest of the time she must only think of what she has read. The place is too dark for any more." "Do let us go," said Betty, and she turned and almost fled back to the alley, and through the alley back to the street. There they walked more moderately a space of some rods before she found breath and words. She faced round on her conductor again. "Why do you take me to such a place and tell me such things?" "Will you let that question still rest a little while?" Almost as he spoke, Pitt called another cab, and Betty and he were presently speeding on again, whither she knew not. It was a good time to talk, and she repeated her question. "Instead of answering you, I would like to put a question on my side," he returned. "What do you think is duty, on the part of a servant of Christ, towards such cases? Pray tell me, is there not some system of poor relief in this place?" "Yes, there is the parish help, and sorrowful help it is. The parishes are often very large, the sufferers very many, the cases of fraud and trickery almost, perhaps quite, as numerous as those at least which come to the notice of the parish authorities. The parish authorities are but average men. Is it wonderful if they are hard administrators? I can tell you, justice is bitterly hard, as she walks the streets here, and mercy's hand has grown rough with friction." Betty looked at the speaker, whose brow was knit, and his eye darkened and flashing, and she half laughed. "You are eloquent," she said. "You ought to be representing the case on the floor of the House of Commons." "Well," he said, coming down to an easier tone, "the parish authorities are but men, as I said, and they grow suspicious, naturally, and in any case the relief they give is utterly insufficient. 1 shilling a week, or 2 shillings a week, what would they do for the people I have been telling you of? And it is hard dealing with the parish authorities. I know it, for here and there at least I have followed Job's example. The cause I knew not, I searched out. One must do that, or one runs the risk of being taken in, and thrown money away upon rogues which ought to go to help honest people." "But that takes time." "Yes, a great deal of time, if it is to be done often. Yes, Mr. Pitt, if you follow that sort of business, it would leave you time for nothing else." "What better can I do with my time?" "Just suppose everybody did the like." "Suppose they did. What would be the state of things?" "I should say the world would be in a better state of health, and the elephant we once spoke of would not shake his head quite so often." "But you are not the elephant, as I pointed out. If I remember, the world does not rest on your head." "Part of it does. Go on and answer my question. What ought I do for these people of whom I have told you?" "But you cannot reach everybody. You can reach only a few." "Yes, for those few, what ought I to do?" "I dare say you know of other cases that you have not said anything about. Equally miserable?" "More miserable, I assure you," said Pitt, looking at her. "What then? Answer my question like a good woman." "I am not a good woman." "Answer it like a good woman anyhow," said Pitt, smiling. "What should I do?" properly, for such people as those I have brought to your notice, apply the golden rule, the only one that can give the measure of things, in their place, and what would you wish, and have a right to wish, that someone would do for you? What may those who have nothing demand from those who have everything? Why, they could demand all you have got. Not justly. Can you not set your imagination to work and answer me? I am not talking for nothing. Take my old Christian, near 80, who sees a sunbeam for 1 hour in the 24, when the sun rises, and uses it to read her Bible. The rest of the 24 hours without even the company of a sunbeam. Imagine, what would you, in her place, wish for? I should wish to die, I think. It would be welcome to Mrs. Gregory, I do not doubt, though perhaps for a different reason. Still, you would not counsel suicide or manslaughter. While you continued in life, what would you like? Oh, said Betty with emphatic utterance, I would like a place where I could breathe. Better lodgings? Fresh air. I would beg for air. Of all the horrors of such places, the worst seems to me the want of air fit to breathe. Then you think she ought to have a better lodging, in a better quarter. She cannot pay for it. I can. Ought I to give it to her? Betty fidgeted inwardly. The conditions of the cab did not allow of much external fidgeting. I do not know why you ask me this, she said. No, but indulge me. I do not ask you without a purpose. I am afraid of your purpose. Yes, if I must tell you, I should say, oh, and take me out of this. Let me see the sun, whenever he can be seen in this rainy London. And let me have sweet air outside my windows. Then I would like somebody to look after me, to open my window in summer and make my fire in winter, and prepare nice meals for me. I would like good bread, and a cup of drinkable tea, and a little bit of butter on my bread, and clothes enough to keep clean. And then I would like to live to thank you. Betty had worked herself up to a point where she was very near a great burst of tears. She stopped with a choked sob in her heart and looked out of the cab window. Pitt's voice changed when he spoke. This is just what I thought. And you have done it? No, I am doing it. I could not at once find what I wanted. Now I have got it, I believe. Go on now, please, and tell me what ought to be done with the man in rheumatic fever. The doctor would know better than I. He cannot pay for a doctor. But he ought to have one. Yes, I thought so. I see what you're coming to, said Betty. But, Mr. Pitt, I cannot see that it is your duty to pay physician's bills for everybody that cannot afford it. I am not talking of everybody. I am talking of this Mr. Hutchins. But there are plenty more as badly off, as badly and worse. You cannot take care of them all. Therefore, what is your deduction from that fact? Where are you going to stop? Where ought I to stop? Put yourself, in imagination, in that condition I have described, the chill of a rheumatic fever and a room without fire, in the depth of winter. What would your sense of justice demand from the well and strong and comfortable and able? Honestly. Why, said Betty, again surveying Pitt from one side, with my notions I should want a doctor and an attendant and a comfortable room. I do not doubt his notions would agree with yours, if his fancy could get so far. But who ought to furnish those things for him is another question. Another, but not more hard to answer. The Bible rule is, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it. Will you, ought you, to do all that you find to do? But Pitt went on, in a quiet business tone. In that same court I found, some time ago, a man who had been injured by an accident. A heavy piece of iron had fallen on his foot. He worked in a machine shop. For months he was obliged to stay at home under the doctor's care. He used up all his earnings, and strength and health were alike gone. The man of 50 looked like 70. The doctor said he could hardly grow strong again without change of air. Mr. Pitt, said Betty, and stopped. He has a wife and 9 children. What did you do? What would you have done? I don't know. I never thought it was my business to supplement all the world's failures. Suppose for a moment it were Christ the Lord himself in either of these situations we have been looking at. I cannot suppose it. How would you feel about ministry then? Betty was silent, choked with discomfort now. Would you think you could do enough? But, Miss Frere, he says it is himself in every case of his servants, and what is done to them he counts as done to himself. And so it is. Looking again keenly at the speaker, Betty was sure that the eyes which did not meet hers were soft with moisture. What did you do for that man? I sent him to the seaside for 3 weeks. He came back perfectly well, but then his employers would not take him on again. They said they wanted younger men, so I had to find new work for him. There was another old woman you told me of in that dreadful court. What did you do for her? Put her in clover, said Pitt, smiling. I moved Hutchins and his family into a better lodging, where they could have a room to spare, and then I paid Mrs. Hutchins to take care of her. You might go on for all I see and spend your whole life and all you have in this sort of work. Do you think it would be a disagreeable disposition to make of both? Why, yes, said Betty. Would you give up all your tastes and pursuits, literary and artistic and antiquarian, and I don't know what all, and be a mere walking benevolent society? No need to give them up, any further than as they would interfere with something more important and more enjoyable. More enjoyable? Yes, I think, Miss Betty, the pleasure of doing something for Christ is the greatest pleasure I know. Betty could have cried with vexation, in which, however, there was a distracting mingling of other feelings: admiration of Pitt, envy of his evident happiness, regret that she herself was so different, but above all, dismay that she was so far off. She was silent the rest of the drive. End of chapter 43. Recording by Yvonne Theodore.
Chapter 44 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran-Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 44. The Duke of Trefoil. They drove a long distance, much of the way through uninteresting regions. Pitt stopped the cab at last, took Betty out, and led her through one and another street and round corner after corner, till at last he turned into an alley again. "Where are you taking me now, Mr. Pitt?" she asked, in some trepidation. "Not another Martin's Court. I want you to look well at this place." "I see it. What for?" asked Betty, casting her eyes about her. It was a very narrow alley, leading again, as might be seen by the gleam of light at the farther end, into a somewhat more open space, another court. Here the word open had no application. The sides of the alley were very near together and very high, leaving a strange gap between walls of brick, at least strange when considered with reference to human habitation. All of freedom or expanse there was indicated anywhere being a long and very distant strip of blue sky overhead when the weather was clear. Not even that today. The heavy clouds hung low, seeming to rest upon the housetops, and shutting up all below under their breathless envelope. Hot, sultry, stifling, the air felt to Betty, well nigh unendurable, but Pitt seemed to be of intent that she should endure it for a while, and with some difficulty she submitted. Happily the place was cleaner than Martin's Court, and no dead cats nor decaying vegetables poisoned what air there was. But surely someone else poisoned it. The doors of dwellings on the one side and on the other stood open, and here and there a woman or two had pressed to the opening with her work, both to get light and to get some freshness, if there were any to be had. Halfway down the alley, Pitt paused before one of these open doors. A woman had placed herself as close to it as she could, having apparently some fine work in hand for which she could not get light enough. Betty could without much difficulty see past her into the space behind. It was a tiny apartment, smaller than anything Miss Frere had ever seen used as a living room, yet a living room it was. She saw that a very minute stove was in it, a small table, and another chair, and on some shelves against the wall there was apparently the inmate's store of what stood to her for china and plate. 2 cups Betty thought she could perceive. What else might be there the light did not serve to show. The woman was respectable looking, because her dress was whole and tolerably clean, but it showed great poverty nevertheless, being frequently mended and patched, and of that indeterminate dull gray to which all colors come with overmuch wear. She seemed to be middle-aged, but as she raised her head to see who had stopped in front of her, Betty was so struck by the expression and tale-telling of it that she forgot the question of age. Age? She might have been 150 years old, to judge by the life-weary set of her features. A complexion that told of confinement, eyes dim with overstraining, lines of face that spoke weariness and disgust, and further, what to Betty's surprise seemed a hostile look of defiance. The face cleared, however, as she saw who stood before her. A great softening and a little light came into it. She rose and dropped a curtsy, which was evidently not a mere matter of form. "How do you do, Mrs. Mills?" said Pitt, and his voice was very gentle as he spoke, and, half to Betty's indignation, he lifted his hat also. "This is rather a warm day." "Well, it be, sir," said the woman, resuming her seat. "It nigh stifles the heart in one, it do. I am afraid you cannot see to work very well, the clouds are so thick." "I thank you, sir. The clouds is always thick, these days. Had you business with me, Mr. Dallas?" "Not today, Mrs. Mills. I am showing this lady a bit of London." "And would the lady be your wife, sir?" "Oh, no," said Pitt, laughing a little. "You honor me too much. This is an American lady, from over the sea ever so far, and I want her to know what sort of a place London is." "It's a bitter poor place for the likes of us," said the woman. "You should show her where the grand folk lives, that built these houses for the poor to be stowed in." "Yes, I have showed her some of those, and now I have brought her to see your part of the world." "It's not to call a part of the world," said the woman. "Do you call this a part of the world, Mr. Dallas? I mind when I lived where trees grow, and there was primroses in the grass. Them's happier that hasn't known it. If you asked me sometimes, I would tell you that this is hell. Yet it ain't so bad as most. It's what folk call very decent." "Oh, yes, it's decent, it is, no doubt. I'll be carried out of it some day, and bless the day." "How is your boy?" "He's fairly, sir, thank you." "No better?" said Pitt gently. "He won't never be no better," the woman said, with a doggedness which Betty gasped was assumed to hide the tenderer feeling beneath. "He's done for. There ain't nothin' but ill luck comes upon folk as lives in such a hole, and couldn't other." "I'll come and see you about Tim," said Pitt. "Keep up a good heart in the meanwhile. Good-bye. I'll see you soon." He went no farther in that alley. He turned and brought Betty out, called another cab, and ordered the man to drive to Kensington Gardens. Till they arrived there he would not talk, bade Betty wait with her questions. The way was long enough to let her think them all over several times. At last the cab stopped. Pitt handed her out, and led her into the gardens. Here was a change. Trees of noble age and growth shadowed the ground. Greensward stretched away in peaceful smoothness. The dust and the noise of the great city seemed to be escaped. It was fresh and shady, and even sweet. They could hear each other speak without unduly raising their voices. Pitt went on till he found a place that suited him, and they sat down in a refreshing greenness and quiet. "Now," said Betty, "I suppose I may ask, what did you take me to that last place for?" "That will appear in due time. What did you think of it?" "It is difficult to tell you what I think of it. Is much of London like that?" "Much of it is far worse." "Well, there is nothing like that in New York or Washington." "Do not be too sure. There is something like that wherever rich men are congregated in large numbers to live." "Rich men?" cried Betty. "Yes, So far as I know, this sort of thing is to be found nowhere else but where rich men dwell. It is the growth of their desire for large incomes. That woman we visited, what did you think of her? She impressed me very much, and oddly. I could not quite read her look. She seemed to be in a manner hostile, not to you, but I thought to all the world beside. A disagreeable look. She is a lace mender. A lace mender? Broke in Betty. Down in that den of darkness? And she pays— Did you see where she lived? I saw a room not bigger than a good-sized box. Is that all? There is an inner room, or box, without windows, where she and her child sleep. For that lodging that woman pays 1/2 crown a week, that is, about 5 shillings American money, to one of the richest noblemen in England. A nobleman! Cried Betty. The Duke of Trefoil. A nobleman, Betty repeated. A duke and a lace mender, and 5 shillings a week! The glass roofs of his hothouses and greenhouses would cover an acre of ground. His wife sits in a boudoir opening into a conservatory where it is summer all year round. Roses bloom, and violets, and geraniums wreath the walls, and palm trees are grouped around fountains. She eats ripe strawberries every day in the year if she chooses, and might, like Judah, wash her feet in the blood of the grape. The fruit is so plenty. The while my lace mender strains her eyes to get 1/2 crown a week for his grace. All that alley and its poor crowded lodgings belong to him. I don't wonder she looks bitter, poor thing. Do you suppose she knows how her landlord lives? I doubt if she does. She perhaps never heard of the house and gardens at Trefoil Park, but in her youth she was a servant in a good house in the country. Not so great a house, and she knows something of the difference between the way the rich live and the poor. She is very bitter over the contrast, and I cannot much blame her. Yet it is not just. Which? Said Pitt, smiling. That feeling of the poor towards the rich. Is it not? It has some justice. I was coming home one night last winter, late, and found my way obstructed by the crowd of arrivals to an entertainment given at a certain great house. The house stood a little back from the street, and carpeting was laid down for the softly shod feet to pass over. Of course there were gathered a small crowd of lookers-on, pressing as near as they were allowed to come, trying to catch, if they might, a gleam or a glitter from the glories they could not approach. I don't know if the contrast struck them, but it struck me. The contrast between those satin slippers treading the carpet and the bare feet standing on the muddy stones, feet that had never known the touch of a carpet anywhere, nor of anything else, either clean or soft. But those contrasts must be, Mr. Dallas. Must they? Is not something wrong, do you think, when the Duke of Trefoil eats strawberries all the year long, and my lace mender, in the height of the season, perhaps never sees one? When the Duchess sits in her bower of beauty, with the violets under her feet and the palms over her head, and the poor in her husband's houses cannot get a flower to remind them that all the world is not like a London alley? Does not something within you say that the scales of the social balance might be a little more evenly adjusted? How are you going to do it? If you do not feel that, Pitt went on, I am afraid that some of the lower classes do. I said I did not know whether the contrast struck the people that night, but I do know it did. I heard words and saw looks that betrayed it. And when the day comes that the poor will know more and begin to think about these things, I am afraid there will be trouble. But what can you do? That is exactly what I was going to ask you, said Pitt, changing his tone and with a genial smile. Take my lace mender for an example. These things must be handled in detail, if at all. She is bitter in the feeling of wrong done her somewhere, bitter to hatred. What can, not you, but I, do for her, to help her out of it? I should say that is the Duke of Trefoil's business. I leave his business to him. What is mine? You have done something already, I can see, for she makes an exception of you. I have not done much, said Pitt gravely. What do you think it was? Her boy was ill, he had met with an accident, and was a thin, pale, wasted-looking child when I first saw them. I took him a rose bush in full flower. Were they so glad of it?" Pitt was silent for a minute. "It was about as much as I could stand, to see it. Then I got the child some things that he could eat. He is well now, as well as he ever will be." "I did not see the rose bush." "Ah, it did not live. Nothing could there." "Well, Mr. Pitt, haven't you done your part, as far as this case is concerned?" "Have I? Would you stop with that?" Betty sat very quiet, but internally fidgeted. What did Pitt ask her these questions for? Why had he taken her on this expedition? She wished she had not gone. She wished she had not come to England. And yet she would not be anywhere else at this moment but where she was, for any possible consideration. She wished Pitt would be different, and not fill his head with lace menders and London alleys. And yet, even so, things might be worse. Suppose Pitt had devoted his energies to gambling, and absorbed all his interests in hunters and racers. Betty had known that sort of thing, and now summarily concluded that men must make themselves troublesome in one way or another. But this particular turn this man had taken did seem to set him so far off from her. "What would you do, Mr. Pitt?" she said, with a somewhat weary cadence in her voice which he could not interpret. "Look at it and tell me, from your standpoint. If you took that woman out of those lodgings, there would come somebody else into them, and you might begin the whole thing over again. In that way the Duke of Trefoil might give you enough to do for a lifetime." "Well, the conclusion?" "How can you ask? Some things are self-evident." "What do you think that means? He that hath two coats, let him impart to him that hath none?" "I don't think it means that," said Betty, "that you are to give away all you have, till you haven't left yourself an overcoat." "Are you sure? Not if somebody else needed it more?" "That is the question. We come back to the whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils. How, do you think, can I best do that in the case of Mrs. Mills and her boy? One thing at a time. Never mind what the Duke of Trefoil may complicate in the future." "Raise the dead?" Betty echoed. "Aye," he said. "There are worse deaths than that of the body." Betty paused, but Pitt waited. "If they are to be kept alive in any sense," she said at last, "they must be taken out of that hole where they are now. And, as you truly suggest that the number of persons wanting such relief is unlimited, the first thing to be done is to build proper houses for the poor. That is what I have set about." "You have?" cried Betty. "I cannot do much, true, but that is nothing whatever to the question. I have begun to put up a few houses, which shall be comfortable, easy to keep clean, and rentable for what the industrious poor can afford to pay. That will give sufficient interest for the capital expended, and even allow me, without further outlay, to go on extending my accommodations. Mrs. Mills will move into the first of my new houses, I hope, next month." "What have you taken me all this day's expedition for, Mr. Dallas?" Betty asked suddenly. The pain of the thing was pressing her. "You remember, you asked a question of me, to wit, whether I were minded still as I seemed to be minded last year. I have showed you a fraction of the reasons why I should not have changed, and you have approved them." Betty found nothing to answer. It was difficult not to approve them, and yet she hated the conclusion. The conversation was not resumed immediately. All the quiet beauty of the scene round them spoke, to Betty, for a life of ease and luxury. It seemed to say, keep at a distance from disagreeable things. If want and squalor are in the world, you belong to a different part of the world. Let London be London. You stay in Kensington Gardens. Take the good of your advantages and enjoy them. That this was the noblest view or the justest conclusion, she would not say to herself, but it was the view in which she had been brought up, And the leopard spots, we know, are persistent. Pitt had been brought up so too. What a tangent he had taken from the even round of society in general! Not to be brought back? "I see," she began after a while. "From my window at your house I see at some distance what looks like a large and fine mansion amongst trees and pleasure grounds. Whose is it?" "That is Holland House." "Holland House? It looks very handsome outside." "It is one of the finest houses about London, and it is better inside than outside." "You have been inside?" "A number of times. I am sorry I cannot take you in, but it is not open to strangers." "How did you get in?" "With my uncle." "Holland House. I have heard that the society there is very fine." "It has the best society of any house in London, and that is the same, I suppose, as to say any house in the world." "Do you happen to know that by experience?" "Yes. It's positive, not its relative character," he said, smiling. "But however, I suppose you pass for an Englishman." "Yes, but I have seen Americans there. My late uncle, Mr. Strahan, was a very uncommon man, full of rare knowledge, and very highly regarded by those who knew him. Lord Holland was a great friend of his, and he was always welcomed at Holland House. I slipped in under his wing." "Then, since Mr. Strahan's death, you do not go there any more?" "Yes, I have been there. Lord Holland is one of the most kindly men in the kingdom, and he has not withdrawn the kindness he showed me as Mr. Strahan's nephew and favourite." "If you go there, you must go into a great deal of London society," said Betty, wondering. "I am afraid you have been staying at home for our sakes. Mrs. Dallas would not like that." "No," said Pitt, "the case is not such. Once in a while I have gone to Holland House, but I have not time for general society." "Not time?" "No," said Pitt, smiling at her expression. "Not time for society. That is it possibly because of Martin's Court, and the Duke of Trefoil's alley, and the like?" "What do you think?" said Pitt, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "There is society and society, you know. Can you drink from two opposite sides of a cup at the same time?" "But one has duties to society," objected Betty, bewildered somewhat by the argument and the smile together. "So I think, and I am trying to meet them. Do not mistake me. I do not mean to undervalue real society. I will take gladly all I can that will give me mental stimulus and refreshment. But the round of fashion is somewhat more vapid than ever, I grant you, after a visit to my lace mender. Those two things cannot go together. Shall we walk home? It is not very far from here. I am afraid I have tired you." Betty denied that, but she walked home very silently. End of chapter 44. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 45 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 45. The Abbey. This interruption of the pleasure sights was alone in its kind. Pitt let the subject that day so thoroughly handled thenceforth drift out of sight. He referred to it no more, and continually, day after day, he gave himself up to the care of providing new entertainment for his guests. Drives into the country, parties on the river, visits to grand places, to picture galleries, to curiosities, to the British Museum, alternated with and succeeded each other. Pitt seemed untirable. Mrs. Dallas was in a high state of contentment, trusting that all things were going well for her hopes concerning her son and Miss Frere. But Betty herself was going through an experience of infinite pain. It was impossible not to enjoy at the moment these enjoyable things. The life at Pitt's old Kensington house was like a fairy tale for strangeness and prettiness. But Betty was living now under a clear impression of the fact that it was a fairy tale, and that she must presently walk out of it. And gradually the desire grew uppermost with her to walk out of it soon, while she could do so with grace and of her own accord. The pretty house which she had so delighted in began to oppress her. She would presently be away and have no more to do with it, and somebody else would be brought there to reign and enjoy as mistress. It tormented Betty, that thought. Somebody else would come there, would have a right there, would be cherished and cared for and honored, and have the privilege of standing by Pitt in his works and plans, helping him and sympathizing with him. A floating image of a fair, stately woman with speaking gray eyes and a wonderful pure face would come before her when she thought of these things, though she told herself it was little likely that she would be the one. Yet Betty could think of no other, and almost felt superstitiously sure at last that Esther it would be, in spite of everything. Esther it would be, she was almost sure. If she, Betty, spoke one little word of information, would she have done well to speak it? Now it was too late. "I think, Mrs. Dallas," she began one day, "I cannot stay much longer with you. Probably you and Mr. Dallas may make up your minds to remain here all the winter. I should think you would. If I can hear of somebody going home that I know, I will go while the season is good." Mrs. Dallas roused up and objected vehemently. Betty persisted. "I am in a false position here," she said. "It was all very well at first, things came about naturally, and it could not be helped, and I am sure I have enjoyed it exceedingly. But, dear Mrs. Dallas, I cannot stay here always, you know. I am ashamed to remember how long it is already." "My dear, I am sure my son is delighted to have you," said Mrs. Dallas, looking at her. "He is not delighted at all," said Betty, half laughing. Poor girl, she was not in the least light-hearted. Bitterness can laugh as easily as pleasure sometimes. "He is a very kind friend, and a perfect host, but there is no reason why he should care about my coming or going, you know." "Everybody must care to have you come, and be sorry to have you go, Betty." "Everybody is a general term, ma'am, and always leaves room for important exceptions. I shall have his respect, and my own too, better if I go now." "My dear, I cannot have you," said Mrs. Dallas uneasily, but afraid to ask a question. "No, we shall not stay here for the winter. Wait a little longer, Betty, and we will take you down into the country and make the tour of England. It is more beautiful than you can conceive. Wait till we have seen Westminster Abbey, and then we will go. You can grant me that, my dear?" Betty did not know how to refuse. "Has Pitt got over his extravagances of last year?" the elder lady ventured, after a pause. "I do not think he gets over anything," said Betty, with inward bitter assurance. The day came that had been fixed for a visit to the Abbey. Pitt had not been eager to take them there, had rather put it off. He told his mother that one visit to Westminster Abbey was nothing, that 2 visits were nothing, that a long time and many hours spent in study and enjoyment of the place were necessary before one could so much as begin to know Westminster Abbey. But Mrs. Dallas had declared that she did not want to know it, she only desired to see it and see the monuments. And what could be answered to that? So the visit was agreed upon and fixed for this day. "You did not want to bring us here because you thought we would not appreciate it?" Betty said to Pitt, in an aside, as they were about entering. "Nobody can appreciate it who takes it lightly," he answered. That day remained fixed in Betty's memory forever, with all its details sharp cut in. The moment they entered the building, the greatness and beauty of the place seemed to overshadow her, and roused up all the higher part of her nature. With that, it stirred into keen life the feeling of being shut out from the life she wanted. The Abbey, with the rest of all the wonders and antiquities and rich beauties of the city, belonged to the accessories of Pitt's position and home, belonged so in a sort to him, and the sense of the beauty which she could not but feel met in the girl's heart with the pain which she could not bid away, and the one heightened the other after the strange fashion that pain and pleasure have of sharpening each other's powers. Betty took in with an intensity of perception all the riches of the Abbey that she was capable of understanding, and her capacity in that way was far beyond the common. She never in her life had been quicker of appreciation. The taste of beauty and the delight of curiosity were at times exquisite, never failing to meet and heighten that underlying pain which had so moved her whole nature to sentient life. For the commonplace and the indifferent she had today no toleration at all. They were regarded with impatient loathing. Accordingly, the progress round the Poet's Corner, which Mrs. Dallas would make slowly, was to Betty almost intolerable. She must go as the rest went, but she went making silent protest. "You do not care for the poets, Miss Betty?" remarked Mr. Dallas jocosely. "I see here very few names of poets that I care about," she responded. "To judge by the rest, I should say it was about as much of an honor to be left out of Westminster Abbey as to be put in." "Fie, fie, Miss Betty! What heresy is here? Westminster Abbey? Why, it is the last desire of ambition." "I am beginning to think ambition is rather an empty thing, sir." "See, here is Butler. Don't you read Hudibras?" "No, sir." "You should. It's very clever. Then here is Spenser, next to him. You are devoted to the Fairy Queen, of course." "I never read it." "You might do worse," remarked Pitt, who was just before them with his mother. "Does anybody read Spenser now?" "It is a poor sign for the world if they do not." "One cannot read everything," said Betty. "I read Shakespeare. I am glad to see his monument." It was a relief to pass on at last from the crowd of literary folk into the nobler parts of the Abbey, and yet, as the impression of its wonderful beauty and solemn majesty first fully came upon Miss Frere, it was oddly accompanied by an instant jealous pang. "He will bring somebody else here some day, who will come as often as she likes, be at home here, and enjoy the Abbey as if it were her own property." And Betty wished she had never come, and in the same inconsistent breath was exceedingly rejoiced that she had come. Yes, she would take all of the beauty in that she could, take it and keep it in her memory forever, taste it while she had it, and live on the aftertaste for the rest of her life. But the taste of it was, at the moment, sharp with pain. Pitt had procured for one of the canons, who had been his uncle's friend, an order which permitted them to go their own way and take their own time, unaccompanied and untrammelled by vergers. No showman was necessary in Pitt's presence. He could tell them all, and much more than they cared about knowing. Mrs. Dallas, indeed, cared for little beyond the tokens of England's antiquity and glory. Her interest was mostly expended on the royal tombs and those connected with them. For was not Pitt now, virtually, one of the favored nation, by habit and connection as well as in blood? And did not England's greatness send down a reflected light on all her sons? Only poetical justice, as it was earlier sons who had made the greatness. But of that Mrs. Dallas did not think. England was an abstract idea of majesty and power, embodied in a land and a government, and Westminster Abbey was in a sort the record and visible token of the same, and testimony of it, in the face of all the world. So Mrs. Dallas enjoyed Westminster Abbey, and her heart swelled in contemplation of its glories. But its real glories she saw not. Lights and shadows, coloring, forms of beauty, associations of tenderness, majesties of age, had all no existence for her. The one feeling in exercise, which took its nourishment from all she looked upon, was pride. But pride is a dull kind of gratification, and the good lady's progress through the Abbey could not be called satisfactory to one who knew the place. Mr. Dallas was neither proud nor pleased. He was, however, an Englishman, and Westminster Abbey was intensely English, and to go through and look at it was the right thing to do. So he went, doing his duty. And beside these two went another bit of humanity, all alive and quivering, intensely sensitive to every impression, which must needs be more or less an impression of suffering. Her folly, she told herself, it was which had so stripped her of her natural defences, and exposed her to suffering. The one only comfort left was, that nobody knew it, and nobody should know it. The practice of society had given her command over herself, and she exerted it that day, all she had. They were making the tour of St. Edmund's Chapel. "Look here, Betty," cried Mrs. Dallas, who was still a little apart from the others with her son. "Come here and see this. Look here, the tomb of 2 little children of Edward III. After going over some of the other records, ma'am, I can but call them happy to have died little." "But isn't it interesting? Pitt tells me there were 6 of the little princess's brothers and sisters that stood here at her funeral, the Black Prince among them. Just think of it! Around this tomb!" "Why should it be more interesting to us than any similar gathering of common people? There is many a spot in country graveyards at home where more than 6 members of a family have stood together." "But, my dear, these were Edward III's children." "Yes, he was something when he was alive, but what is he to us now? And why should we care?" Betty hastily went on to generalities, seeing the astonishment in Mrs. Dallas's face. "Why should we be more interested in the monuments and deaths of the great than in those of lesser people? In death and bereavement all come down to a common humanity." "Not a common humanity," said Mrs. Dallas, rather staring at Betty. "All are alike on the other side, Mother," observed Pitt. "The king's daughter and the little village girl stand on the same footing, when once they have left this state of things. There is only one nobility that can make any difference then." "One nobility?" repeated Mrs. Dallas, bewildered. "You remember the words, 'Whosoever shall do the will of my Father, which is in heaven, the same is my mother and my sister and brother.' The village girl will often turn out to be the daughter of the king then." "But you do not think, do you," said Betty, "that all that one has gained in this life will be lost, or go for nothing? Education, knowledge, refinement, all that makes one man or woman really greater and nobler and richer than another, will that be all as though it had not been? No advantage?" "What we know of the human mind forbids us to think so. Also, the analogy of God's dealings forbids it. The child and the fully developed philosopher do not enter the other world on an intellectual level. We cannot suppose it. But all the gain on the one side will go to heighten his glory or to deepen his shame, according to the fact of his having been a servant of God or no." "I don't know where you are getting to," said Mrs. Dallas, a little vexedly. "If we are to proceed at this rate," suggested her husband, "we may as well get leave to spend all the working days of a month in the Abbey. It will take us all that." "After all," said Betty, as they moved, "you did not explain why we should be so much more interested in this tomb of Edward III's children than in that of any farmer's family?" "My dear," said Mrs. Dallas, "I am astonished to hear you speak so. Are not you interested?" "Yes, ma'am, but why should I be? For really, often the farmer's family is the more respectable of the two." "Are you such a Republican, Betty? I did not know it." "There is a reason, though," said Pitt, repressing a smile, "which even a Republican may allow. The contrast here is greater. The glory and pomp of earthly power is here brought into sharp contact with the nothingness of it. So much yesterday, so little today. Those uplifted hands in prayer are exceedingly touching when one remembers that all their mightiness has come down to that." "It is not every fool that thinks so," remarked Mr. Dallas ambiguously. "No," said Betty with a sudden impulse of championship. "Fools do not think at all." "Here is a tablet to Lady Knollys," said Pitt, moving on. "She was a niece of Anne Boleyn, and waited upon her to the scaffold." "But that is only a tablet," said Mrs. Dallas. "Who is this, Pitt?" She was standing before an effigy that bore a coronet, Betty beside her. "That is the Duchess of Suffolk, the mother of Lady Jane Grey." "I see," said Betty, "that the Abbey is a complement of the Tower. Her daughter and her husband lie there, under the pavement of the chapel. How comes she to be here?" "Her funeral was after Elizabeth came to the throne, But she had been in miserable circumstances, poor woman, before that. I wonder she lived at all, said Betty, after losing husband and daughter in that fashion. But people do bear a great deal and live through it. Which words had an application quite private to the speaker, and which no one suspected. And while the party were studying the details of the tomb of John of Eltham, Pitt explaining and the others trying to take it in, Betty stood by with passionate thoughts. They do not care, she said to herself, but he will bring someone else here, some day, who will care, and they will come to the Abbey, and delight themselves in its glories and in each other, alternately. What do I hear? And what is the English Abbey to me? She showed no want of interest, however, and no wandering thought. On the contrary, an intelligent, thoughtful, gracious attention to everything she saw and everything she heard. Her words, she knew, though she could not help it, were now and then flavored with bitterness. In the next chapel Mrs. Dallas heard with much sympathy and wonder the account of Catherine of Valois and her remains. I don't think she ought to lie in the vault of Sir George Villiers, if he was father of the Duke of Buckingham, she exclaimed. That Duke of Buckingham had more honor than belonged to him in life and in death, said Betty. It does not much make difference now, said Pitt. They went on to the chapel of Henry VII, and here, and on the way thither, Betty almost for a while forgot her troubles in the exceeding majesty and beauty of the place. The power of very exquisite beauty, which always and in all forms testifies to another world where its source and its realization are, came down upon her spirit, and hushed it as with a breath of balm, and the littleness of this life, of any one individual's life, in the midst of the efforts here made to deny it, stood forth in most impressive iteration. Betty was awed and quieted for a minute. Mr. and Mrs. Dallas were moved differently. And this was Henry VII's work, exclaimed Mr. Dallas, making an effort to see all round him at once. Well, I didn't know they could build so well in those old times. Let us see, when was he buried? 1509? That is pretty long ago. This is a beautiful building. And that is his tomb, eh? I should say this is better than anything he had in his lifetime. Being King of England was not just so easy to him as his son found it. Crowns are heavy in the best of times, and his was specially. It is a strange ambition, though, to be glorified so in one's funeral monument, said Betty. A very common ambition, remarked Pitt, but this chapel was to be much more than a monument. It was a chantry. The king ordered 10,000 masses to be said here for the repose of his soul, and intended that the monkish establishment should remain forever to attend to them. Here around his tomb you see the king's particular patron saints, 9 of them, to whom he looked for help in time of need. All over the chapel you will find the 4 national saints, if I may so call them, of the kingdom, and at the end there is the Virgin Mary, with Peter and Paul, and other saints and angels innumerable. The whole chapel is like those touching folded hands of stone we were speaking of, a continual appeal, through human and angelic mediation, fixed in stone, though at the beginning also living in the chants of the monks. Well, I am sure that is being religious, said Mrs. Dallas. If such a place as this does not honor religion, I don't know what does. Mother, Christ said, I am the door. Yes, my dear, but is not all this an appeal to him? Mother, he said, He that believeth on me hath everlasting life. What have saints and angels to do with it? He that believeth. Surely the builder of all this must have believed, said Mrs. Dallas, or he would never have spent so much money and taken so much pains about it. If he had believed on Christ, Mother, he would have known he had no need. Think of those 10,000 masses to be said for him, that his sins might be forgiven and his soul received into heaven. You see how miserably uncertain the poor king felt of ever getting there. Well, said Mrs. Dallas, everyone must feel uncertain. He cannot know. How can he know? How can he live and not know? Pitt answered in a lowered tone. Uncertainty on that point would be enough to drive a thinking man mad. Henry VII, you see, could not bear it, and so he arranged to have 10,000 masses said for him, and filled his chapel with intercessory saints. But I do not see how anyone is to have certainty, Mr. Pitt, Betty said. One cannot see into the future. It is only necessary to believe in the present. Believe what? The word of the King, who promised, Whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. The love that came down here to die for us will never let slip any poor creature that trusts it. Yes, but suppose one cannot trust so, objected Betty. Then there is probably a reason for it. Disobedience, even partial disobedience, cannot perfectly trust. How can sinful creatures do anything perfectly, Pitt? His mother asked, almost angrily. Mamma, said he gravely, you trust me so. Mrs. Dallas made no reply to that, and they moved on, surveying the chapels. The good lady bowed her head in solemn approbation when shown the place whence the bodies of Cromwell and others of his family and friends were cast out after the Restoration. They had no business to be there, she assented. Where were they removed to? Betty asked. Some of them were hanged as they deserved, said Mr. Dallas. Cromwell, Ireton, and Bradshaw at Tyburn, it added. The others were buried, not honorably, not far off. One of Cromwell's daughters, who was a churchwoman and also a royalist, they allowed to remain in the Abbey. She lies in one of the other chapels, over yonder. Noble revenge, said Betty quietly. Very proper, said Mrs. Dallas. It seems hard, but it is proper. People who rise up against their kings should be treated with dishonor, both before and after death. How about the kings who rise up against their people? Asked Betty. She could not help the question, but she was glad that Mrs. Dallas did not seem to hear it. They passed on, from one chapel to another, going more rapidly, came to a pause again at the tomb of Mary, Queen of Scots. I am beginning to think, said Betty, that the history of England is one of the sorrowfulest things in the world. I wonder if all other countries are as bad? Think of this woman's troublesome, miserable life. And now, after Fotheringay, the honor in which she lies in this temple is such a mockery. I suppose Elizabeth is here somewhere? Over there, in the other aisle. And below, the two Tudor queens, Elizabeth and Mary, lie in a vault together, alone. Personal rivalries, personal jealousies, political hatred and religious enmity, they are all composed now, and all interests fade away before the one supreme, eternal. They are gone where the honor that cometh from God is the only honor left. Well for them if they have that. Here is the Countess of Richmond, the mother of Henry VII. She was of kin, or somehow connected, it is said, with 30 royal personages. The granddaughter of Catherine of Valois, grandmother of Henry VIII, Elizabeth's great-grandmother. She was, by all accounts, a noble old lady. Now all that is left is these pitiful folded hands. Mrs. Dallas passed on, and they went from chapel to chapel, and from tomb to tomb, with unflagging though transient interest. But for Betty, by and by the brain and sense seemed to be oppressed and confused by the multitude of objects, of names and stories and sympathies. The novelty wore off, and a feeling of some weariness supervened, and therewith the fortunes and fates of the great past fell more and more into the background, and her own one little life venture absorbed her attention. Even when going round the chapel of Edward the Confessor, and viewing the grand old tombs of the magnates of history who are remembered there, Betty was mostly concerned with her own history, and a dull, bitter feeling filled her. It was safe to indulge it, for everybody else had enough beside to think of, and she grew silent. "You are tired," said Pitt kindly, as they were leaving the confessor's chapel and his mother and father had gone before. "Of course," said Betty. "There is no going through the ages without some fatigue for a common mortal." "We are doing too much," said Pitt. "The Abbey cannot be properly seen in this way. One should take part at a time, and come many times." "No chance for me," said Betty. "This is my first and my last." She looked back as she spoke towards the tombs they were leaving, and wished, almost, that she were as still as they. She felt her eyes suffusing, and hastily went on. "I shall be going home, I expect, in a few days, as soon as I find an opportunity. I have stayed too long now, but Mrs. Dallas has overpersuaded me. I am glad I have had this, at any rate." She was capable of no more words just then, and was about to move forward, when Pitt, by a motion of his hand, detained her. "One moment," said he. "Do you say that you are thinking of returning to America?" "Yes, it is time." "I would beg you, if I might, to reconsider that," he said. "If you could stay with my mother a while longer, it would be, I am sure, a great boon to her. For I am going away. I must take a run over to America. I have business in New York. Must be gone several weeks at least. Cannot you stay and go down into Westmoreland with her?" It seemed to Betty that she became suddenly cold, all over. Yet she was sure there was no outward manifestation in face or manner of what she felt. She answered mechanically, indifferently, that she would see, and they went forward to rejoin their companions. But of the rest of the objects that were shown them in the Abbey she simply saw nothing. The image of Esther was before her, in New York, found by Pitt, in Westminster Abbey, brought thither by him, and lingering where her own feet now lingered, in the house at Kensington, going up the beautiful staircase, and standing before the cabinet of coins in the library. Above all, found by Pitt in New York, for he would find her. Perhaps even now he had news of her. She would be coming with hope and gladness and honor over the sea, while she herself would be returning, crossing the same sea the other way, in every sense the other way, in mortification and despair and dishonor. Not outward dishonor, and yet the worst possible. Dishonor in her own eyes. What a fool she had been, to meddle in this business at all! She had done it with her eyes open, trusting that she could exercise her power upon anybody and yet remain in her own power. Just the reverse of that had come to pass, and she had nobody to blame but herself. If Pitt was leaving his father and mother in England to go to New York, it could be on only one business. The game, for her, was up. There were weeks of torture before her, she knew. Slow torture, during which she must show as little of what she felt as an Indian at the stake. She must be with Mrs. Dallas, and hear the whole matter talked of, and from point to point as the history went on, and must help talk of it. For if Pitt was going to New York now, Betty was not. That was a fixed thing. She must stay for the present where she was. She was a little pale and tired, they said, on the drive home, and that was all anybody ever knew. End of chapter 45, recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 46 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 46. A Visit. Pitt sailed for America in the early days of autumn, and September had not yet run out when he arrived in New York. His first researches, as on former occasions, amounted to nothing, and several days passed with no fruit of his trouble. The intelligence received at the post office gave him no more than he had been assured of already. They believed a letter did come occasionally to a certain Colonel Gainsborough, but the occasions were not often. The letters were not called for regularly, and the address, further than that it was New York, was not known. Pitt was thrown upon his own resources, which narrowed down pretty much to observation and conjecture. To exercise the former, he perambulated the streets of the city. His brain was busy with the latter constantly, whenever its energies were not devoted to seeing and hearing. He roved the streets in fair weather and foul, and at all hours. He watched keenly all the figures he passed, at least until assured they had no interest for him. He peered into shops, he reviewed equipages. In those days it was possible to do this to some purpose, if a man were looking for somebody. The streets were not as now, filled with a confused and confusing crowd, going all ways at once, and no policeman was needed, even for the most timid, to cross Broadway where it was busiest. What a chance there was then for the gay part of the world to show itself! A lady would heave in sight, like a ship in the distance, and come bearing down with colors flying. One all alone, or two together, having the whole sidewalk for themselves. Slowly they would come and pass, in the full leisure of display, and disappear, giving place to a new sail just rising to view. No such freedom of display and monopoly of admiration is anywhere possible any longer in the city of Gotham. Pitt had been walking the streets for days, and was weary of watching the various feminine craft which sailed up and down in them. None of them were like the one he was looking for, neither could he see anything that looked like the colonel's straight, slim figure and soldierly bearing. He was weary, but he persevered. A man in his position was not open to the charge of looking for a needle in a haystack, such as would now be justly brought to him. New York was not quite so large then as it is now. It is astonishing to think what a little place it was in those days, when Walker Street was not yet built on its north side, and there was a pond at the corner of Canal Street, and Chelsea was in the country, when the West End was at State Street, and St. George's Church was in Beekman Street, and Beekman Street was a place of fashion. The city was neither so dingy nor so splendid as it is now, and the bright sun of our climate was pouring all the gold it could upon its roofs and pavements, those September days when Pitt was trying to be everywhere and to see everything. One of those sunny, golden days he was sauntering as usual down Broadway, enjoying the clear ether which was troubled by neither smoke nor cloud. Sauntering along carelessly, yet never for a moment forgetting his aim, when his eye was caught by a figure which came up out of a side street and turned into Broadway just before him. Pitt had but a cursory glance at the face, but it was enough to make him follow the owner of it. He walked behind her at a little distance, scrutinizing the figure. It was not like what he remembered Esther. He had said to himself, of course, that Esther must be grown up before now. Nevertheless, the image in his mind was of Esther as he had known her, a well-grown girl of 13 or 14. This was no such figure. It was of fair medium height, or rather more. The dress was as plain as possible, yet evidently that of a lady, and as unmistakable was the carriage. Perhaps it was that more than anything which fixed Pitt's attention. The erect, supple figure, the easy, gliding motion, and the set of the head. For among all the multitude that walk, a truly beautiful walk is a very rare thing, and so is a truly fine carriage. Pitt could not take his eyes from this figure. A few swift strides brought him near her, and he followed, watching, balancing hopes and doubts. That was not Esther as he remembered her, but then years had gone by, and was not that set of the head on the shoulders precisely Esther's? He was meditating how he could get another sight of her face, when she suddenly turned and ran up a flight of steps and went in at a door, without ever giving him the chance he wanted. She had a little portfolio under her arm, like a teacher, and she paused to speak to the servant who opened the door to her. Pitt judged that it was not her own house. The lady was probably a teacher. Esther could not be a teacher, but at any rate he would wait and get another sight of her. If she went in, she would probably come out again. But Pitt had a tiresome waiting of an hour. He strolled up and down, or stood still, leaning against a railing, never losing that door out of his range of vision. The hours seemed 3. However, at the end of it, the lady did come out again, but just when he was at his farthest, and she turned and went up the street again the way she had come, walking with a quick step. Pitt followed. Where she had turned into Broadway, she turned out of it and went down an unattractive side street, passing from that into another and another, less and less promising with every corner she turned, till she entered the one which we know was not at all eligible where Colonel Gainsborough lived. Pitt's hopes had been gradually falling, and now, when the quarry disappeared from his sight in one of the little humble houses which filled the street, he for a moment stood still. Could she be living here? He would have thought she had come merely to visit some poor protégé, but that she had certainly seemed to take a latchkey from her pocket and let herself in with it. Pitt reviewed the place, waited a few minutes, and then went up himself the few steps which led to that door, and knocked. Bell there was none. People who had bells to their doors did not live in that street. But as soon as the door was opened, Pitt knew where he was, for he recognized Barker. She was not the one, however, with whom he wished first to exchange recognitions, so he contented himself with asking in an assured manner for Colonel Gainsborough. "Yes, sir, he's in," said Barker doubtfully. As he stood in the doorway, she could not see the visitor well. "Who will I say wants to see him, sir?" "A gentleman on business." Another minute or two, and Pitt stood in the small room which was the Colonel's particular room, and was face to face with his old friend. Esther was not there, and without looking at anything, Pitt felt in a moment the change that must have come over the fortunes of the family. The place was so small. There did not seem to be room in it for the Colonel and him. But the Colonel was like himself. They stood and faced each other. "Have I changed so much, Colonel?" he said at last. "Do you not know me?" "William Dallas?" said the Colonel. "I know the voice. But yes, you have changed. You have changed, certainly. It is the difference between the boy and the man. What else it is, I cannot see in this light, or this darkness. It grows dark early in this room. Sit down. So you have got back at last." The greeting was not very cordial, Pitt felt. "I have come back, for a time, but I have been home repeatedly before this." "So I suppose," said the Colonel dryly. "Of course, hearing nothing of you, I could not be sure how it was." "I have looked for you, sir, every time and almost everywhere." "Looked for us? Ha! It is not very difficult to find anybody when you know where to look." "Pardon me, Colonel Gainsborough, that was precisely not my case. I did not know where to look. I have been here for days now, looking, till I was almost in despair, only I knew you must be somewhere, and I would not despair. I have looked for you in America and in England. I went down to Gainsborough Manor to see if I could hear tidings of you there. Every time that I came home to Seaforth for a visit, I took a week of my vacation and came here and hunted New York for you. Always in vain." "The shortest way would have been to ask your father," said the Colonel, still dryly. "My father? I asked him, and he could tell me nothing. Why did you not leave us some clue by which to find you?" "Clue?" said the Colonel. "What do you mean by clue? I have not hid myself." "But if your friends do not know where you are—" "Your father could have told you." "He did not know your address, sir. I asked him for it repeatedly." "Why did he not give it to you?" said the Colonel, throwing up his head like a war horse. "He said you had not given it to him." "That is true since we came to this place. I have had no intercourse with Mr. Dallas for a long time, not since we moved into our present quarters, and our address here he does not know, I suppose. He ceased writing to me, and of course I ceased writing to him. From you we have never heard at all, since we came to New York." "But I wrote, sir," said Pitt in growing embarrassment and bewilderment. "I wrote repeatedly. What do you suppose became of your letters?" "I cannot say. I wrote letter after letter, till, getting no answer, I was obliged to think it was in vain, and I too stopped writing." "Where did you direct your letters?" "Not to your address here, which I did not know. I enclosed them to my father, supposing he did know it, and begged him to forward them." "I never got them," said the Colonel. with that same dry accentuation. It implied doubt of somebody. And could Pitt blame him? He kept in mortified silence for a few minutes. He felt terribly put in the wrong, and undeservedly. But he tried not to think. "I am afraid to ask what you thought of me, sir?" "Well, I confess, I thought it was not just like the old William Dallas that I used to know, or rather, not like the young William. I supposed you had grown old, and with age comes wisdom. That is the natural course of things." "You did me injustice, Colonel Gainsborough." "I am willing to think it, but it is somewhat difficult. Take my word at least for this. I have never forgotten. I have never neglected. I sought for you as long as possible, and in every way that was possible, whenever I was in this country. I left off writing, but it was because writing seemed useless. I have come now in pursuance of my old promise, come on the mere chance of finding you, which, however, I was determined to do." "Your promise?" "You surely remember. The promise I made you, that I would come to look for you when I was free, and if I was not so happy as to find you, would take care of Esther." "Well, I am here yet," said the colonel meditatively. "I did not expect it, but here I am. You are quit of your promise." "I have not desired that, sir." "Well, that count is disposed of, and I am glad to see you." But Pitt did not feel the truth of the declaration. "Now tell me about yourself." In response to which followed a long account of Pitt's past, present, and future, so far as his worldly affairs and condition were concerned, and so far as his own plans and purposes dealt with both. The colonel listened, growing more and more interested, thought out a good deal in his manner, yet maintained on the whole an indifferent apartness which was not in accordance with the old times, and the liking he then certainly cherished for his young friend. Pitt could not help the feeling that Colonel Gainsborough wished him away. It began to grow dark, and he must bring this visit to an end. "May I see Esther?" he asked, after a slight pause in the consideration of this fact, and with a change of tone which a mother's ear would have noted, and which perhaps Colonel Gainsborough's was jealous enough to note. The answer had to be waited for a second or two. "Not tonight," he said, a little hurriedly. "Not tonight. You may see her tomorrow." Pitt could not understand his manner, and went away with half a frown and half a smile upon his face, after saying that he would call in the morning. It had happened all this while that Esther was busy upstairs, and so had not heard the voices, nor even knew that her father had a visitor. She came down soon after his departure to prepare the tea. The lamp was lit, the little fire kindled for the kettle, the table brought up to the colonel's couch, which, as in old times, he liked to have so, and Esther made his toast and served him with his cups of tea, in just the old fashion. But the way her father looked at her was not just in the old fashion. He noticed how tall she had grown. It was no longer the little Esther of Seaforth times. He noticed the lovely lines of her supple figure, as she knelt before the fire with the toasting fork, and raised her other hand to shield her face from the blaze. His eye lingered on her rich hair in its abundant coils, on the delicate hands, but though it went often to the face, it as often glanced away and did not dwell there. Yet it could not but come back again, and the colonel's own face took a grim set as he looked. Oddly enough, he said never a word of the event of the afternoon. "You had somebody here, Papa, a little while ago, Barker says." "Yes." "Who was it?" "Called himself a gentleman on business." "What business, Papa? It is not often that business comes here. It wasn't anything about taxes?" "No." "I've got all that ready," said Esther contentedly, "so he may come when he likes. The taxman, I mean. What business was this then, Papa?" "It was something about an old account, my dear, that he wanted to set right. There had been a mistake, it seems." "Anything to pay?" inquired Esther with a little anxiety. "No, it's all right, or so he says." Esther thought it was somewhat odd, but, however, was willing to let the subject of a settled account go, and she had almost forgotten it when her father broached a very different subject. "Would you like to go to live in Seaforth again, Esther?" "Seaforth, Papa?" she repeated, much wondering at the question. "No, I think not. I loved Seaforth once, dearly, but we had friends there then, or we thought we had. I do not think it would be pleasant to be there now." "Then what do you think of our going back to England? You do not like this way of life, I suppose, in this pitiful place? I have kept you here too long." What had stirred the colonel up to so much speculation? Esther hesitated. "Papa, I know our friends there seem very eager to have us, and so far it would be good. But if we went back, have we enough to live upon and be independent?" "No." "Then I would rather be here. We are doing very nicely, Papa. You are very comfortable, are you not? I am very well placed and earning money. Enough money. Really, we are not poor any longer, and it is so nice to be independent." "Not poor," said the colonel between a groan and a growl. "What do you call poor? For you and for me to be in this doleful street is to be all that, I should say." "Papa," said Esther, her lips wreathing into a smile, "I think nobody is poor who can live and pay his debts, and we have no debts at all." "By dint of hard work on your part and deprivation on mine." "Papa," said Esther, the smile fading away, "what did he mean by deprivation? I hoped you were comfortable?" "Comfortable!" groaned and growled the colonel again. "I believe, Esther, you have forgotten what comfort means, or rather, you never knew. For us to be in a prison like this and shut out from the world! Papa, I never thought you cared for the world. And this does not feel like a prison to me. I have been very happy here, and free, and, oh, so thankful. If you remember how we were before, Papa." "All the same," said the colonel, "it is not fitting that those who are meant for the world should live out of it. I wish I had taken you home years ago. You see nobody. You have seen nobody all your life but one family, and I wish you had never seen them." "The Dallases? Oh, why, Papa?" "You do not care for them, I suppose, now?" "I do not care for them at all, Papa. I did care for one of them very much, once, but I have given him up long ago. When I found he had forgotten us, it was not worth while for me to remember. That is all dead. His father and mother, I doubt if ever they were real friends to you or to me, Papa. I am inclined to think William was not so much to blame. It was his father's fault, perhaps." "It does not make much difference," said Esther easily. "If anything could make him forsake us, after the old times, he is not worth thinking about, and I do not think of him. That is an ended thing." There was a little something in the tone of the last words which allowed the hearer to divine that the closing of that chapter had not been without pain, and that the pain had perhaps scarcely died out. But he did not pursue the subject, nor say any more about anything. He only watched his daughter, uninterruptedly, though stealthily, watched every line of her figure, glanced at the sweet, fair face, followed every quiet, graceful movement. Esther was studying, and part of the time she was drawing, absorbed in her work, yet throughout, what most struck her father was the high happiness that sat on her whole person. It was in the supreme calm of her brow. It was in a half-appearing smile which hardly broke, and yet informed the soft lips with a constant sweetness. It seemed to the colonel to appear in her very positions and movements, and probably it was true, for the lines of peace are not seen in an uneasy figure, nor do the movements of grace come from a restless spirit. The colonel's own brow should have unbent at the sweet sight, but it did not. He drew his brows lower and lower over his watching eyes, and now and then set his teeth in a grim sort of way for which there seemed no sort of provocation. The heart knoweth his own bitterness. No doubt Colonel Gainsborough's tasted its own particular draught that night, which he shared with nobody. End of chapter 46. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 47 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran-Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 47. A Talk. The next day began for Esther quite in its wonted wise, and it will be no harm to see how that was. She was up very early, a long while before the sun, and after a somewhat careful dressing, for it was not in Esther's nature to do anything imperfectly, she went downstairs to her father's little study or dwelling room. It was free for her use at this time of day. The colonel took a late breakfast, and was never up long before it. This had grown to be his invalid habit. In the early days of his life and of military service, no doubt it had been different. The room was empty and still at this hour. Even Mrs. Barker was not yet astir, and a delightful sense of privacy and security encompassed the temporary occupant. The weather was still warm. No fire would be needed till it was time for the colonel's toast. Moving like a mouse, or better, like a gentle domestic spirit, Esther lit a lamp, opened a window to let the morning air in, and sat down to her book. Do you think it was philosophy, or science, or languages, or schoolwork? Nay, it was something which with Esther went before all these, and if need were, would have excluded all of them. She had time for them too, as things were, but this must come first. She must draw water from the wells of salvation before she felt freshened up for the rather weary encounters and dry routine of school life. She must feel the rock under her feet and breathe the air of heaven a bit before she ventured forth into the low-lying grounds and heavy vapors of earthly business and intercourse, and she must have her armor well on and bright before she dared to meet the possible dangers and temptations which might come to her in the course of the day. It is true, this day was a free day, but that made no difference. Being at home had its trials and difficulties as well as being abroad. But drawing from those wells and breathing that air, Esther thought nothing of trials or difficulties. And, in matter of fact, for her they hardly seemed to exist, or were perceived, as it were, dimly, and their contact scarce felt. I suppose it is true in all warfares, that a well-armed and alert soldier is let alone by the foes that would have swallowed him up if he had been defenseless or not giving heed. And if you could have seen Esther's face during that hour, you would understand that all possible enemies were, at least for the time, as hushed as the lions in Daniel's den. So glad, so grave, so pure and steadfast, so enjoying, was the expression which lay upon it. Reading and praying and reading, an hour good went by. Then Esther rose up, ready for the work of the day. She threw open all the windows and put out her lamp. Then she gave both the rooms the careful cleaning and dusting and putting in order, set the table in the one for breakfast, and laid the fire in the other, to be lit whenever her father might desire it. All this done and in readiness, she sat down again to study. This time it was study of a lower grade, partly preparation for schoolwork, partly reading for her own advancement, though there was not much time for this latter. It was long past 8, and Mrs. Barker came with a chafing dish of red coals in the tea kettle. She stood by while Esther made the tea, looking on or meditating, and then began to blow the coals in the chafing dish. She blew the coals and looked at Esther. "Miss Esther," she began, "did Master say anything about the visitor that came to see him yesterday?" "Not much. Why?" "He said it was somebody on business." "Well, Mum, he didn't look like that sort of person at all." "Why not? Any sort of person might come on business, you know." "True, Mum, but this wasn't that sort of person. If Christopher had opened the door for him, he'd 'a' knowed. But my eyes is that poor when I'm looking out into the light, I can't seem to see nothin' that's nearer me. But howsomever, Mum, what I did see of him, somehow, it put me in mind of Seaforth." "Seaforth? Why? Who did you think it was?" "I am sure, Mum, I don't know. I couldn't see good, with the light behind him, and he standin' in the doorway, and I can't say how it was, but what he made me think of, it was Seaforth, Mum." "I am afraid you have been thinking of Seaforth, Barker," said Esther, with half a sigh. "It could not have been anybody we used to know. Papa went there, you know, last summer to see old friends, or to see what had become of them, and Mr. and Mrs. Dallas were gone to England to their son, and with them the young lady he is to marry. I dare say he may be married by this time, or just going to be married. He has quite forgotten us, you may be sure. I do not expect ever to see him again. Was this man yesterday young or old?" "Young, Mum, and tall and straight and very personable. I'd like to see his face, but it may be as you say." Perhaps Esther would have put some further question to her father at breakfast about his yesterday's visit, but as it happened she had other things to think of. The Colonel was in a querulous mood, not altogether uncommon in these days, but always very trying to Esther. When he seemed contented and easy, she felt repaid for all labors or deprivations, but when that state of things failed, and he made himself uncomfortable about his surroundings, there would come a miserable cui bono feeling. If he were not satisfied, then what did she work for? And what was gained by it all? This morning she was just about to put a question when Colonel Gainsborough began. "Is this the best butter one can get in this town?" "Papa, I do not know," said Esther, brought back from yesterday to today with a sudden pull. "It is Mrs. Bounder's butter, and we have always found it very good, and she lets us have it at a lower rate than we could get it in the stores." "Nothing is good that is got at a low rate. I do not believe in that plan. It is generally a cheat in the end." "It has been warm weather, you know, Papa, and it is difficult to keep things so nice without a cool cellar." "That is one of the benefits of living in Major Street. It ought to be called minor, for we are minus nearly everything, I think." What could Esther say? "My dear, what sort of bread is this?" "It is from the baker's, Papa. Is it not good?" "Baker's bread is never good, not fit to nourish life upon. How comes it we have baker's bread? Barker knows what I think of it." "I suppose she was unable to bake yesterday." "And of course today her bread will be too fresh to be eatable. My dear, cannot you bring a little system into her ways?" "She does the very best she can, Papa." "Yes, yes, I know that, as far as the intention goes, but all such people want a head over them. They know nothing whatever about system. By the way, can't she fry her bacon without burning it? This is done to a crisp." "Papa, I am very sorry. I did not mean to give you a burnt piece. Mine is very good. Let me find you a better bit." "It doesn't matter," said the Colonel, giving his plate an unloving shove. "A man lives and dies, all the same, whether his bacon is burnt or not. I suppose nothing matters. Are you going to that party at Mrs. I forget her name?" "I think not, Papa." "Why not?" Esther hesitated. "Why not? Don't you like to go?" "Yes, sir, I like it very well." "Then why don't you go? At least you can give a reason." "There are more reasons than one," said Esther. She was extremely unwilling to reveal either of them. "Well, go on. If you know them, you can tell them to me. What are they?" "Papa, it is really of no consequence, and I do not mind in the least. But in truth, my old silk dress has been worn till it is hardly fit to go anywhere in." "Can't you get another?" "I should not think it right, Papa. We want the money for other things." "What things?" Did he not know? Esther drew breath to answer. "Papa, there are the taxes, which I agreed with Mrs. Bounder I would pay, you know, as part of the rent. The money is ready, and that is a great deal more pleasure than a dress and a party would be to me. And then winter is coming on, and we must lay in our fuel. I think to do it now while it is cheaper. And so, for that, you are to stay at home and see nobody. Isn't it right, Papa? And whatever is right is always pleasant in the end." "Deucedly pleasant," said the Colonel grimly, and rising from the table. I am going to my room, Esther, and I do not wish to be called to see anybody. If business comes, you must attend to it." "Called to see anybody? Whoever came to that house, on business or otherwise, but at the most rare intervals? And now, one business visit had just come yesterday. There might not be another in months." Esther looked a little sorrowful, for her father's expression, most unwanted from his mouth, showed his irritation to be extreme. But what had irritated him? However, she was somewhat accustomed to this sort of demonstration, which nevertheless always grieved her, and she was glad that she had escaped telling her father her second reason. The truth was, Esther's way of life was so restricted and monotonous outwardly, she lived so by herself and to herself, that the stimulus and refreshment of a social occasion, like that one when she had met Miss Frere a year ago, was almost too pleasant. It made Esther feel a little too sensibly how alone and shut out from human intercourse was the nobler part of herself. A little real intellectual converse and contact was almost too enjoyable. It was a mental breath of fresh air, in which life seemed to change and become a different thing. And then, we all know how close air seems after fresh, the routine of school teaching and the stillness and uniformity of her home existence seemed to press upon her painfully, till after time she became wonted to it again. So, on the whole, she thought it not amiss that her old party dress had done all the service it decently could, and that she had no means to get another. And now, after a few moments' grave shadow on her face, all shadows cleared away, as they usually did, and she set herself to the doing of what this holiday at home gave her to do. There was mending, making up accounts, a drawing to finish for a model. After that, if she could get it all done in time, there might be a bit of blessed reading and a new book that her old friend Miss Fairbairn had lent her. Esther set her face bravely to her day's work. The morning was not far advanced, and the mending was not finished, when the unwonted door-knocker sounded again. This time the door was opened by someone whom Pitt did not know, and who did not know him, for Mrs. Bounder had come into town, and, as Margaret's hands were just in her bread, had volunteered to go to the door for her. Pitt was ushered into the little parlor, in which, as nobody was there, he had leisure to make several observations. Yesterday he had no leisure for them. Now he looked about him. That the fortunes of the family must have come down very much, it was evident. Such a street, in the first place, then this little bit of a house, and then there was more than that. He could see tokens unmistakable of scantness of means. The drugget was well worn, had been darned in 2 places, very neatly, but darned it was, and the rest of it threatened breaches. The carpet beyond the drugget was old and faded, and the furniture? Pitt wondered if it could be the same furniture, it looked so different here. There was the Colonel's couch, however. He recognized that, although in its chintz cover, which was no longer new, but faded like the carpet. Books on the table were certainly the Colonel's books, but no pictures were on the walls, no pretty trifles lying about. Nothing was there that could testify of the least margin of means for anything that was not strictly necessary. Yet it was neat and comfortable. But Pitt felt that expenditures were very closely measured, and no latitude allowed to ease or to fancy. He stood a few minutes, looking and taking all this in, and then the inner door opened, and he forgot it instantly. At one stroke, as it were, the mean little room was transformed into a sacred temple, and here was the priestess. The 2 young people stood a second or two silent, facing each other. But Esther knew him at once, and more, as she met the frank, steadfast eyes that she had known and trusted so long ago, she trusted them at once again and perfectly. There was no mistaking either their truth or their kindness. In spite of his new connections and alienated life, her old friend had not forgotten her. She extended her hand, with a flash of surprise and pleasure in her face, which was not a flash but a dawn, for it grew and brightened into warmer kindliness. "Pitt Dallas," she said, "it is really you." The 2 hands met and clasped and lay in each other, but Pitt had no words for what went on within him. With the first sight of Esther he knew that he had met his fate. Here was all that he had left 6 or 7 years ago. How changed! The little head, so well set on its shoulders, with its wealth of beautifully ordered hair, those wonderful, grave, soft, sweet, thoughtful eyes, the character of the quiet mouth, the pure dignity and grace of the whole creature, all laid a spell upon the man. He found no words to speak audibly, but in his mind words heaped on words, and he was crying to himself, "Oh, my beauty! Oh, my gazelle! My fair saint! My lily! My queen!" What right he had to the personal pronoun does not appear. However, we know that appropriation is an instinct of humanity for that which it likes, and it may also be noted that Pitt never thought of calling Esther a rose, nor would anyone else. That was not her symbol. Roses are sweet, sweeter than anything, and yielding in fairness to nothing, but, let me be pardoned for saying it, they are also common, and Esther was rather something apart, rare. If I liken her to a lily, I do not mean those fair white lilies which painters throw at the feet of Franciscan monks, and dedicate also to the Virgin, Annunciation lilies, so called. They are common too, and rather specially emblems of purity. What I am thinking of, and what Pitt was thinking of, is, on the contrary, one of those unique exotic lilies which are as much wonders of color as marbles of grace. Apart, reserved, pure, also lofty, and delicate to the last degree, queening it over all the rest of the flowers around, not so much by official preeminence of beauty as by the superiority of the spiritual nature, a difference internal and ineffable, which sets them, of necessity, aside of the crowd and above it. Pitt felt all this in a breath which I have taken so many words clumsily to set forth. He, as I said, took no words, and only gave such expression to his thoughts as he could at the moment by bowing very low over Esther's hand and kissing it. Something about the action hurt Esther. She drew her hand away. "It is a great surprise," she said quietly. "Won't you sit down?" "The surprise ought to have been that you did not see me before, not that I am here now." "I got over that surprise a great while ago," said Esther. "At least I thought I did, but it comes back to me now that I see you. How was it? How could it be?" In answer to which, Pitt gave her a detailed account of his various efforts in past years to discover the retreat of his old friends. This was useful to him. He got his breath, as it were, which the sight of Esther had taken away, was himself again. Esther listened silently, with perfect faith in the speaker and his statements, with a little undefined sort of regretfulness. So, then, Pitt need not have been lost to them, if only they could have been found. Just what that thought meant she had no time then to inquire. She hardly interrupted him at all. "What do you suppose became of your letters?" she asked when he had done, for Pitt had not said that they went to his father's hands. "I suppose they shared the fate of all letters uncalled for, if not the dead letter office, the fire. It was not very strange that you could not find us when you came to New York. We really troubled the post office very little, having after a while nothing to expect from it, and that was the only place where you could hope to get a clue. Neither would Esther mention Mr. Dallas. With a woman's curious fine discernment, she had seen that all was not right in that quarter. Indeed, had suspected it long ago. "But you got some letters from me," Pitt went on, "while you were in Seaforth? 1 or 2, I know." "Yes, several. Oh, yes, while we were in Seaforth. And I got answers. Do you remember one long letter you wrote me the 2nd year after I went?" "Yes," she said, without looking at him. "Esther, that letter was worth everything to me. It was like a sunbeam coming out between misty clouds and showing things for a moment in their true colors. I never forgot it. I never could forget it, though I fought for some years with the truth it revealed to me. I believed what you told me, and so I knew what I ought to do, but I struggled against my convictions. I knew from that time that it was the happiest thing and the worthiest thing to be a saint. All the same, I wanted to be a sinner. I wanted to follow my own way and be my own master. I wanted to distinguish myself in my profession and rise in the world and tower over other men. And I liked all the delights of life as well as other people do, and was unwilling to give up a life of self-indulgence which I had means to gratify. Esther, I fought hard. I fought for years, can you believe it? Before I could make up my mind. And now, she said, looking at him. Now? Now, said he, lowering his voice a little. Now I have come to know the truth of what you told me. I have learned to know Christ. And I know, as you know, that all things that may be desired are not to be compared with that knowledge. I understand what Paul meant when he said he had suffered the loss of all things for it, and counted them less than nothing. So do I. So would I. So have I, as far as the giving up of myself and them to their right owner goes. That is done. Esther was very glad. She knew she ought to be very glad, and she was, and yet gladness was not precisely the uppermost feeling that possessed her. She did not know what in the world could make her think of tears at that moment, but there was a strange sensation as if, had she been alone, she would have liked to cry. No shadow of such a softness appeared, however. What decided you at last? She said softly. I can scarce tell you, he answered. I was busy studying the matter, arguing for and against, and then I saw of a sudden that I was fighting a lost battle, that my sense and reason and conscience were all gained over, and only my will held out. Then I gave up fighting any more. You came up to the subject on a different side from what I did, Esther remarked. And you, Esther, have you been always as happy as you were when you wrote that letter? Yes, she said quietly, more happy, but she did not look up. The happiness in your letter was the sunbeam that cleared up everything for me. Now I have talked enough. Tell me of yourself and your father. There is not much to tell, said Esther, with that odd quietness. She felt somehow oppressed. We are living in the old fashion, have been living so all along. But quite in the old fashion? He said, with a swift glance at the little room where they were sitting. It does not look so, Esther. This is not so pleasant a place as we were in when we first came to New York, Esther confessed. That was very pleasant. Why did you change? It was necessary, she said with a smile. You may as well know it. Papa lost money. How? He invested the money from the sale of the place at Seaforth in some stocks that gave out somehow. He lost it all. So then we had nothing but the stipend from England, and I think Papa somehow lost part of that, or was obliged to take part of it to meet obligations. And you? We did very well, said Esther with another smile. We are doing very well now. We are out of debt, and that is everything, and I think Papa is pretty comfortable. And Esther? Esther is happy. But I should think, forgive me, that this bit of a house would hardly hold you. See how mistaken you are? We have 2 rooms unused. Pitt's eyes roved somewhat restlessly over the one in which they were, as he remarked, I never comprehended just why you went away from Seaforth. For my education, I believe. You were getting a very good education when I was there. When you were there, repeated Esther, smiling. But then she went on quickly. Papa thought he could not give me all the advantages he wished if we stayed in Seaforth, so we came to New York. And now, you see, I am able to provide for him. The education is turning to account. How? Asked Pitt suddenly. I help out a small income by giving lessons. You? Giving lessons? Not that, Esther? Why not? She said quietly. The thing given one to do is the thing to do, you know, and this certainly was given me, and by means of that we get along nicely. Again Pitt's eye glanced over the scanty little apartment. What sort of getting along was it which kept them here? What do you teach? He asked, speaking out of a confusion of thoughts the one thing that occurred which it was safe to say. Drawing and music and some English branches. Do you like it? She hesitated. I am very thankful to have it to do. I do not fancy that teaching for money is just the same as teaching for pleasure. But I am very glad to be able to do it. Before that, there was a time when I did not know just what was going to become of us. Now I am very happy. Pitt could not at the moment speak all his thoughts. Moreover, there was something about Esther that perplexed him. She was so unmovedly quiet in her manner. It was kind, no doubt, and pleasant, and pleased, and yet there was a smooth distance between him and her that troubled him. He did not know how to get rid of it. It was so smooth, there was nothing to take hold of, while it was so distant, or put her rather at such a distance, that all Pitt's newly aroused feelings were stimulated to the utmost, both by the charm and by the difficulty. How exquisite was this soft dignity and calm! But to the man who was longing to be permitted to clasp his arms round her, it was somewhat aggravating. "What has become of Christopher?" he asked after a pause. "Oh, Christopher is happy," said Esther, with a smile that was only too frank and free. Pitt wished she would have shown a little embarrassment or consciousness. "Christopher is happy. He has become a householder and a market gardener, and above all a married man. Married a market gardener's widow, and set up for himself." "What do you do without him?" "Oh, we could not afford him now," said Esther, with another smile. "It was very good for us, almost as good for us as for him. Christopher has become a man of substance. We hire this house of him, or rather of his wife. Are the two not one, then?" Esther laughed. "Yes," she said, "but you know, which one it is depends on circumstances." And she went on to tell about her first meeting with the present Mrs. Bounder, and of all the subsequent intercourse and long chain of kindnesses, to which Pitt listened eagerly, though with a somewhat distracted mind. At the end of her story, Esther rose. End of chapter 47, recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. Chapter 48 of A Red Wallflower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner, Chapter 48. A Settlement. "Will you excuse me if I leave you for one moment to go down into the kitchen?" "What for?" said Pitt, stopping her. "I want to see if Mrs. Barker has anything in the house for lunch." "Sit down again. She certainly will. She always does." "But I want to let her know that there will be one more at table today." "Never mind. If the supplies fall short, I will go out and get some oysters. I know the Colonel likes oysters. Sit still, and let us talk while we can." Esther sat down, a little wondering, for Pitt was evidently in earnest, too much in earnest to be denied. But when she had sat down, he did not begin to talk. He was thinking, and words were not ready. It was Esther who spoke first. "And you, Pitt? What are you going to do?" It was the first time she had called him by his name in the old fashion. He acknowledged it with a pleased glance. "Don't you know all about me?" he said. "I know nothing but what you have told me, and hearsay," added Esther, coloring a little. "Did your father not tell you?" "Papa told me nothing," and therewith it occurred to Esther how odd it was that her father should have been so reticent, that he should not have so much as informed her who his visitor had been. And then it also occurred to her how he had desired not to be called down to see anybody that morning. Then it must be that he did not want to see Pitt? Had he taken a dislike to him? Disapproved of his marriage, perhaps? And how would luncheon be under these circumstances? One thought succeeded another in growing confusion. But then Pitt began to talk, and she was obliged to attend to him. "Then your father did not tell you that I have become a householder too?" No, yes, I heard something said about it," Esther answered, stammering. "He told you of my old uncle's death and gift to me?" "No, nothing of that. What is it?" Then Pitt began and gave her the whole story. of his life with his uncle, of Mr. Strahan's excellences and peculiarities, of his favor, his illness and death, and the property he had bequeathed intact to his grandnephew. He described the house at Kensington, finding a singular pleasure in talking about it, for, as his imagination recalled the old chambers and halls, it constantly brought into them the sweet figure of the girl he was speaking to, and there was a play of light often, or a warm glow, or a sudden sparkle in his eyes, which Esther could not help noticing. Womanlike, she was acute enough also to interpret it rightly, only, to be sure, she never put herself in the place of the person concerned, but gave all that secret homage to another. It is like Pitt, she thought, with a suppressed sigh which she could not stop to criticize. It is like him, as much in earnest in love as in other things. Always in earnest. It must be something to be loved so. However, carrying on such aside reflections, she kept all the while her calm, sweet, dignified manner, which was bewitching Pitt, and entered with generous interest into all he told her, supplying in her own way what he did not tell, and on her part also peopling the halls and chambers at Kensington with two figures, neither of which was her own. Her imagination flew back to the party a year ago, at which she had seen Betty Frere, and mixed up things recklessly. How would she fit into this new life of Pitt, of which he had been speaking a little while ago? Had she changed too, perhaps? It was to be hoped. Pitt ended what he had to say about his uncle and his house, and there was a little pause. Esther half wondered that he did not get up and go away, but there was no sign of that. Pitt sat quietly, thoughtfully, also contentedly, before her, at least so far as appeared. Of all his thoughts, not one of them concerned going away. It had begun to be a mixed pleasure to Esther, his being there, for she thought now that he was married he would be taken up with his own home interests, and the friend of other days, if still living, would be entirely lost. And so every look and expression of his which testified to a fine and sweet and strong character, which proved him greatly ennobled and beautified beyond what she had remembered him, and all his words which showed the gentleman, the man of education, and the man of ability, while they greatly delighted Esther, they began oddly to make her feel alone and poor. Still, she would use her opportunity and make the most of this interview. "And what are you going to be, Pitt?" she asked, when both of them had been quite still for a few minutes. He turned his face quick towards her, with a look of question. "Now you are a man of property," said Esther, "what do you think to do? You were going to read law." "I have been reading law for 2 or 3 years." "And are you going to give it up?" "Why should I give it up?" "The question seems rather, why should you go on with it?" "Put it so," he said. "Ask the question. Why should I go on with it?" "I have asked the question," said Esther, laughing. "You seem to come to me for the answer." "I do. What is the answer? Give it, please. Is there any reason why a man who has money enough to live upon should go to the bar?" "I can think of but one," said Esther, grave and wondering now. "Perhaps there is one reason." "And that?" said Pitt, without looking at her. "I can think of but one," Esther repeated. "It is not a man's business view, I know, but it is mine. I can think of no reason why, for itself, a man should plunge himself into the strifes and confusions of the law, supposing that he need not, except for the one sake of righting the wrong and delivering the oppressed." "That is my view," said Pitt quietly. "And is that what you are going to do?" she said with smothered eagerness and as well a smothered pain. "I do not propose to be a lawyer merely," he said, in the same quiet way, not looking at her. "But I thought it would give me an advantage in the great business of righting the wrong and getting the oppressed go free. So I propose to finish my terms and be called to the bar." "Then you will live in England?" said Esther, with a most unaccountable feeling of depression at the thought. "For the present, probably, wherever I can do my work best." "Your work? That is—" "Do you ask me? said he, now looking at her with a very bright and sweet smile. The sweetness of it was so like the Pitt Dallas she used to know that Esther was confounded. Do you ask me? What should be the work and life of one who was once a slave and is now Christ's freeman? Esther looked at him speechless. You remember, he said, the Lord's word. This is my commandment, that ye love one another, as I have loved you. And then he immediately gave the gauge and measure of that love, the greatest possible, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And you mean? Only that, Queen Esther. I reckon that my life is the Lord's, and that the only use of it is to do his work. I will study law for that, and practice as I may have occasion, and for that I will use all the means he may give me, so far as I can, to break every yoke and let the oppressed go free, to heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out devils, so far as I may. Surely it is the least I can do for my master. Pitt spoke quietly, gravely, with the light of a settled purpose in his eye, and also with the peace of a fixed joy in his face. Indeed, his face said more than his words, to Esther who knew him and it. She read there the truth of what he said, and that it was no fantasy of passing enthusiasm, but a lifelong choice, grave and glad, of which he was telling her. With a sudden movement she stretched out her hand to him, which he eagerly clasped, and their hands lay so in each other for a minute, without other speech than that of the close-held fingers. Esther's other hand, however, had covered her eyes. "What is the matter, Queen Esther?" said Pitt, seeing this. "I am so glad, and so sorry." Esther took down her hand. She was not crying. "Glad for you, and sorry that there are so very few who feel as you do. Oh, how very strange it is." He still held her other hand. "Yes," he said thoughtfully, "it is strange. What do you think of the old word in the Bible, that it is not good for man to be alone?" "I suppose it is true," said Esther, withdrawing her hand. "Now," she thought, "he is going to tell me about his bride and his marriage." And she rather wished she could be spared that special communication. At the same time, the wondering speculation seized her again, whether Betty Frere, as she had seen her, was likely to prove a good helpmate for this man. "You suppose it is true? There can be no doubt about that, I think, for the man. How is it for the woman?" "I have never studied the question," said Esther. "By what people say, the man is the more independent of the two when he is young, and the woman when she is old. Neither ought to be independent of the other." "They seldom are," said Esther, feeling inclined to laugh, although not in the least merry. Pitt was silent a few minutes, evidently revolving something in his mind. "You said you had 2 rooms unoccupied," he began at last. "I want to be some little time in New York yet. Will you let me move into them?" "You?" exclaimed Esther. "Yes," he said, looking at her steadfastly. "You do not want them, and I do." "I do not believe they would suit you, Pitt," said Esther, consumed with secret wonder. "I am sure no other could suit me half so well. What do you think your bride would say to them? You know that must be taken into consideration." "My bride? I beg your pardon. Did I hear you aright?" "Yes," said Esther, opening her eyes a little. "Your bride, your wife. Isn't she here?" "Who is she?" "Who was she, do you mean? Or are you perhaps not married yet?" "Most certainly not married. But may I beg you to go on? You were going to tell me who the lady is supposed to be?" "Oh, I know," said Esther, smiling, yet perplexed. "I believe I have seen her, and I admire her too, Pitt, very much, though when I saw her, I do not think she would have agreed with the views you have been expressing to me." "Where did you see her?" "Last fall. Oh, a year ago almost. Time enough for minds to change. It was at a party here." "And you saw whom?" "Miss Frere. Isn't she the lady?" "Miss Frere!" exclaimed Pitt. and his color changed a little. May I ask how this story about me has come to your ears and been believed, as I see you have accepted it? Why, very straight, said Esther, her own color flushing now brightly. It was not difficult to believe. It was very natural, at least to me, who have seen the lady. Miss Frere and I are very good friends, said Pitt, which state of things, however, might not long survive our proposing to be anything more. But we never did propose to be anything more. What made you think it? Did Papa tell you that he went up to Seaforth this summer? He said nothing about it. He did go, however. It was a very great thing for Papa to do, too, for he goes nowhere, and it is very hard for him to move. But he went. It was in August. We had heard not a word from Seaforth for such a long, long time, not for 2 or 3 years, I think, and not a word from you, and Papa had a mind to see what was the meaning of it all, and whether anybody was left in Seaforth or not. I thought everybody had forgotten us, and Papa said he would go and see. Yes, said Pitt, as Esther paused. And, of course, you know, he found nobody. All our friends were gone, at least, and people told Papa you had been home the year before, and had been in Seaforth a long while, and the lady was there too, whom you were going to marry, and that this year they had all gone over to see you, that lady and all, and the wedding would probably be before Mr. and Mrs. Dallas came home. So Papa came back and told me. And you believed it, of course. How could I help believing it? Said Esther, smiling. But her eyes avoided Pitt now, and her color went and came. It was a very straight story. Yet not a bit of truth in it. Oh, yes, they came over to see me, but I have never thought of marrying Miss Frere, nor any other lady, nor ever shall, unless— You have forgotten me, Esther? Esther sat motionless, that Pitt might have thought she had not heard him, but for the swift flashing color which went and came. She had heard him well enough, and she knew what the words were meant to signify, for the tone of them was unmistakable. But answer in any way Esther could not. She was a very fair image of maidenly modesty and womanly dignity, rather unmistakable, too, in its way, but she spoke not, nor raised an eyelid. Have you forgotten me, Esther? He repeated gently. She did not answer then. She was moveless for another instant, and then, rising, with a swift motion she passed out of the room. But it was not the manner of dismissal or leave-taking, and Pitt waited for what was to come next. And in another moment or two she was there again, all covered with blushes, and her eyes cast down upon an old book which she held in her hand and presently held open. She was standing before him now, he having risen when she rose. From the very fair brow and rosy cheek and soft line of the lips, Pitt's eye at last went down to the book she held before him. There, on the somewhat large page, lay a dried flower. The petals were still velvety and rich-colored, and still from them came a faint sweet breath of perfume. What did it mean? Pitt looked, and then looked closer. It is a charanthus, he said, the red variety. What does it mean, Esther? What does it say to my question? He looked at her eagerly, but if he did not know, Esther could not tell him. She was filled with confusion. What dreadful thing was this, that his memory should not be so good as hers? She could not speak. The lovely, shamefaced flushes mounted up to the delicate temples and told their tale, but Pitt, though he read them, did not at once read the flower. Esther made a motion as if she would take it away, but he prevented her and looked closer. The red charanthus, he repeated. Did it come from Seaforth? I remember old McPherson used to have them in his greenhouse. Esther, did I bring it to you? Christmas, stammered Esther. Don't you remember? Christmas. Of course I do. It was in that bouquet? What became of the rest of it? Papa made me burn all the rest, said Esther, with her own cheeks now burning. And she would have turned away, leaving the book in his hands, with an action of as shy grace as ever Milton gave to his Eve. But Pitt got rid of the book and took herself in his arms instead. And then, for a few minutes, there was no more conversation. They had reached a point of mutual understanding where words would have been superfluous. But words came into their right again. "Esther, do you remember my kissing you when I went away 6 or 7 years ago?" "Certainly." "I think that kiss was in some sort a revelation to me. I did not fully recognize it then, what the revelation was, but I think, ever since I have been conscious, vaguely, that there was an invisible silken thread of some sort binding me to you, and that I should never be quite right till I followed the clue and found you again. The vagueness is gone, and has given place to the most daylight certainty." "I am glad of that," said Esther demurely, though speaking with a little effort. "You always like certainties." "Did you miss me?" "Pitt, more than I can possibly tell you. Not then only, but all the time since. Only one thing has kept me from being very downhearted sometimes, when time passed, and we heard nothing of you, and I was obliged to give you up." "You should not have given me up." "Yes, there was nothing else for it. I found it was best not to think about you at all. Happily, I had plenty of duties to think of, and duties, if you take hold of them right, become pleasures. Doing them for the Master. Yes, and for our fellow creatures too. Both interests come in, and so make life full and rich even in common details of it." "But, Queen Esther, my queen, do you know that you will be my queen always? That word expresses your future position, as far as I am concerned." "No," said Esther a little nervously. "I think hardly. Where there is a queen, there is commonly also a king somewhere, you know. His business is to see the queen's commands carried out." "We will not quarrel about it," said Esther, laughing. "But, after all, Pitt, that is not like you. You always knew your own mind, and always had your own way, when I used to know you. It is your turn." "It would be a very odd novelty in my life," said Esther. "But now, Pitt, I really must go and see about luncheon. Papa will be down, and Mrs. Barker does not know that you are here, and it would be a sort of relief to take hold of something so commonplace as luncheon. I seem to myself to have got into some sort of unreal fairyland." "I am in fairyland too, but it is real. Let me go, Pitt, please." "Luncheon is of no consequence." "Papa will think differently." "I will go out and get him some oysters, to conciliate him." "To conciliate him?" "Yes, he will need conciliating, I can tell you. Do you suppose he will look on complacently and see you, who have been wholly his possession and property, pass over out of his hands into mine? It is not human nature." Esther stood still and colored high. "Does Papa know?" "He knows all about it, Queen Esther, except what you may have said to me. I think he understood what I was going to say to you." "Poor Papa," said Esther thoughtfully. "Not at all," said Pitt inconsistently. "We will take care of him together, much better than you could alone." Esther drew a long breath. "Then you speak to Barker, and I will get some oysters," said Pitt with a parting kiss, and was off in a moment. The luncheon, after all, passed off quite tolerably well. The Colonel took the oysters, and Pitt, with a kind of grim acquiescence. He was an old soldier, and no doubt had not forgotten all the lessons once learned in that impressive school, and as everyone knows, to accept the inevitable and to make the best of a lost battle are two of those lessons. Not that Colonel Gainsborough would seriously have tried to fight off Pitt and his pretensions if he could. At least, not as things were. Pitt had told him his own circumstances, and the Colonel knew that without barbarity he could not refuse ease and affluence and an excellent position for his daughter, and condemn her to school-keeping in Major Street for the rest of her life, especially since the offer was accompanied with no drawbacks, except the one trifle, that Esther must marry. That was an undoubtedly bitter pill to swallow, but the Colonel swallowed it, and hardly made a wry face. He would be glad to get away from Major Street himself. So he ate his oysters, as I said, grimly, was certainly courteous, if also cool. and Pitt even succeeded in making the conversation flow passably well, which is hard to do when it rests upon one devoted person alone. Esther did everything but talk. After the meal was over, the Colonel lingered only a few minutes, just enough for politeness, and then went off to his room again, with the dry and somewhat uncalled for remark that they did not want him. "That is true," said Pitt humorously. "Pitt," said Esther hurriedly, "if you don't mind, I want to get my work. There is something I must do, and I can do it just as well while you are talking." She went off and returned with a drawing board and pencils, took her seat, and prepared to go on with the drawing that had been begun. "What are the claims of this thing to be considered work?" said Pitt, after watching her a minute or two. "It is a copy that I shall need Monday morning. Only a little thing. I can attend to you just the same." "A copy for whom?" "One of my scholars," she said, with a smile at him. "That copy will never be wanted." "Yes, I want it for Monday, and Monday I should have no time to do it. So I thought I would finish it now. It will not take me long, Pitt." "Queen Esther," said he, laying his hand over hers, "all that is over." "Oh, no, Pitt, how should it?" she said, looking at him now, since it was no use to look at her paper. "I cannot have you doing this sort of work any longer." "But," she said, flushing high, "yes, I must." "That has been long enough, my queen. I cannot let you do it any longer. You may give me lessons, nobody else." "But," said Esther, catching her breath. Then, not willing to open the whole chapter of discussion she saw ahead, she caught at the nearest and smallest item. "You know I am under obligations, and I must meet them until other arrangements are made. I am expected, I am depended on. I must not fail. I must give this lesson Monday, and others." "Then I will do this part of the work," said he, taking the pencil from her fingers. "Give me your place, please." Esther gave him her chair and took his, and then she sat down and watched the drawing. Now and then her eyes made a swift passage to his face for a half-second, to explore the features so well known and yet so new. But those were kind of fearful glances, which dreaded to be caught, and for the most part her eyes were down on the drawing and on the hands busied with it. Hands, we know, tell of character, and Esther's eyes rested with secret pleasure on the shapely fingers, which in their manly strength and skilful agility corresponded so well to what she knew of their possessor. The fingers worked on, for a time, silently. "Pitt, this is oddly like old times," said Esther at last. "Things have got into their right grooves again," said he contentedly. "But what are you doing? That is beautiful! But you are making it a great deal too elaborate and difficult for my scholar. She is not far enough advanced for that." "I'll take another piece of paper, then, and begin again. What do you want?" "Just a tree, lightly sketched, and a bit of rock under it. Something like that. She is a beginner." "A tree and a rock?" said Pitt. "Well, here you shall have it. But, Queen Esther, this sort of thing cannot go on, you know." "For a while it must." "For a very little while. In fact, I do not see how it can go on at all. I will go and see your school madam and tell her you have made another engagement." "But every honest person fulfills the obligations he is under, before assuming new ones." "That's past praying for," said Pitt, with a shake of his head. "You have assumed the new ones. Now the next thing is to get rid of the old. I must go back to my work soon. And, Queen Esther, your Majesty will not refuse to go with me?" He turned and stretched out his hand to her as he spoke. In the action, in the intonation of the last words, in the look which went with them, there was something very difficult for Esther to withstand. It was so far from presuming, it was so delicate in its urgency, there was so much wistfulness in it, and at the same time the whole magnetism of his personal influence. Esther placed her hand within his. She could not help that. The bright color flamed up in her cheeks. Words were not ready. "What are you thinking about?" said he. "Papa," Esther said, half aloud, but she was thinking of 1,000 things all at once. I'll undertake the Colonel, said he, going back to his drawing without letting go Esther's hand. Colonel Gainsborough is not a man to be persuaded, but I think in this case he will be of my mind. He was silent again, and Esther was silent too, with her heart beating, and a quiet feeling of happiness and rest gradually stealing in her heart and filling it, like as the tide at flood comes in upon the empty shore. Whatever her father might think upon the just mooted question, those two hands had found each other once and for all. Thoughts went roving, aimlessly, meanwhile, as thoughts will, in such a flood tide of content. Pitt worked on rapidly. Then a word came to Esther's lips. Pitt, you have become quite an Englishman, haven't you? No more than you are an Englishwoman. I think I am rather an American, said Esther. I have lived here nearly all my life. Do you like New York? I was not thinking of New York. Yes, I like it. I think I like any place where my home is. Would you choose your future home rather in Seaforth or in London? You know, I am at home in both. Esther would not speak the woman's answer that rose to her lips, the immediate response, that where he was would be what she liked best. It flushed in her cheek and it parted her lips, but it came not forth in words. Instead came a caring question of business. What are the arguments on either side? Well, said Pitt, shaping his rock with bold strokes of the pencil, in Seaforth the sun always shines, or that is my recollection of it. Does it not shine in London? No, as a rule. Esther thought it did not matter. Then, for another consideration, in Seaforth you would never see, I suppose, almost never, sights of human distress. There are no poor there. And in London? The distress is before you and all around you, and such distress as I suppose your heart cannot imagine. Then, said Esther softly, as far as that goes, Pitt, it seems to me an argument for living in London. He met her eyes with an earnest, warm look of somewhat wistful recognition, intense with his own feeling of the subject, glad in her sympathy, and yet tenderly cognizant of the way the subject would affect her. There is one point, among many, on which you and Miss Frere differ, he said, however, coolly, going back to his drawing. She does not like, or would not like, living in London? I beg your pardon, but she would object to your reason for living there. Esther was silent. Her recollection of Betty quite agreed with his observation. You say you have seen her? Pitt went on presently. Yes. And talked with her? Oh, yes, and liked her too, in a way. Did she know your name? He asked suddenly, facing round. Why, certainly, said Esther, smiling. We were properly introduced, and we talked for a long while, and very earnestly. She interested me. Pitt's brows drew together ominously. Poor Betty! The old Spanish proverb would have held good in her case. If you do not want a thing known of you, don't do it. Pitt's pencil went on furiously fast, and Esther sat by, wondering what he was thinking of. But soon his brow cleared again as his drawing was done, and he flung down the pencil and turned to her. Esther, he said, it is dawning on me, like a glory out of the sky, that you and I are not merely to live our earthly life together, and serve together, in London or anywhere, in the work given us to do. That is only the small beginning. Beyond all that stretches an endless life and ages of better service, in which we shall still be together and love and live with each other. In the light of such a distant glory, is it much if we in this little life on earth give all we have to Him who has brought all that, and all this too, for us? It is not much, said Esther, with a sudden veil of moisture coming over her eyes, through which they shone like two stars. Pitt took both her hands. I mean it literally, he said. So do I. We will be only stewards, using faithfully everything, and doing everything, so as it seems would be most for His honor, and best for His work. Yes, said Esther, but gladness was like to choke her from speaking at all. In India there is not the poorest Hindu but puts by from his every meal of rice so much as a spoonful for his God. That is the utmost he can do. Shall we do less than our utmost?" "Not with my goodwill," said Esther, from whose bright eyes bright drops fell down, but she was looking steadfastly at Pitt. "I am not a very rich man, but I have an abundant independence without asking my father for anything. We can live as we like, Esther. You can keep your carriage if you choose, but for me, I would like nothing so well as to use it all for the Lord Christ." "Oh, Pitt! Oh, Pitt! So would I." "Then you will watch over me, and I will watch over you," said he, with a glad sealing of this compact. "For unless we are strange people, we shall both need watching. And now come here and let me tell you about your house. I think you will like that. There's no need to add any more, except only the one fact that on the day of Esther's marriage, Pitt brought her a bunch of red wallflowers, which he made fast himself to her dress. She must wear, he said, no other flower but that on her wedding day. End of chapter 48, recording by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona. End of A Red Wallflower by Susan Warner.